One forgotten clue connects disappearances, secret codes, vanished civilizations, and a mystery that should be impossible. What if the strangest unsolved cases aren't separate at all? Every answer uncovers a deeper contradiction. Records vanish. Witnesses disagree. Experts hesitate. Follow this trail, and reality starts looking suspiciously incomplete than anyone imagined. The wind moves quietly across the vast grasslands of eastern Mongolia. Rolling hills stretch toward the horizon beneath an endless sky, broken only by scattered rivers, rocky ridges, and the distant silhouettes of mountains. It is a landscape that seems unchanged by centuries, a place where history feels close enough to touch, yet remains frustratingly out of reach. Somewhere within this immense expanse, many believe, lies one of the most sought-after burial sites in human history, the missing tomb of Genghis Khan. More than 800 years ago, Genghis Khan forged the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. Born as Temujin around 1162, he united rival Mongol tribes and led campaigns that reshaped the political map of Eurasia. His armies crossed deserts, mountains, and vast distances with astonishing speed. By the time of his death in 1227, his influence stretched from the Pacific Ocean deep into Central Asia and beyond. Yet, despite the scale of his achievements, the location of his final resting place remains unknown. Historical accounts suggest that secrecy surrounded his burial from the very beginning. According to traditional narratives, Genghis Khan requested a simple and hidden grave. Some chronicles claim that the soldiers escorting his funeral procession killed anyone who crossed their path, ensuring that no witnesses could identify the route. Other stories describe laborers who buried the Khan and were then themselves killed to protect the secret. Whether these accounts are literal truth, exaggeration, or legend layered upon history is difficult to determine. What is clear is that no verified tomb has ever been found. The most widely accepted theory points toward the Kentii Mountains, a rugged region closely associated with Genghis Khan's early life. This area contains dense forests, remote valleys, and sacred landscapes that remain sparsely populated even today. Many historians believe the tomb may lie somewhere within this region, concealed beneath centuries of natural change. Archaeologists have identified numerous ancient burial sites nearby, but none have yielded definitive evidence linked to the Mongol ruler himself. Modern technology has joined the search. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and aerial surveys have all been employed in attempts to locate hidden structures beneath the landscape. Researchers have mapped anomalies, investigated possible burial complexes, and examined long-forgotten ruins. Yet each promising lead eventually fades into uncertainty. The mystery deepens when one considers the cultural context. For many Mongolians, certain sacred areas should remain undisturbed. Some researchers argue that the continued absence of the tomb may not be due to a lack of clues, but rather to a long tradition of respect that has protected the site from discovery. If the grave was intentionally hidden by those closest to the Khan, perhaps it was hidden well enough to survive the centuries intact. Then there are the more speculative possibilities. Some suggest the tomb may not be in the Kentii Mountains at all. Alternative theories place it beneath a river deliberately diverted over the burial site. Others propose that the grave lies inside a forgotten mountain chamber sealed by natural rockfalls. A few researchers have wondered whether the burial was designed to leave almost no archaeological footprint, making discovery far more difficult than expected. Legends add another layer. Stories tell of thousands of horses galloping across the burial ground to erase all traces of disturbed earth. Other accounts describe hidden markers known only to a select group entrusted with guarding the secret. These tales cannot be verified, yet they persist, passed from generation to generation. Perhaps that persistence is part of what makes the mystery so compelling. The absence of evidence has not diminished interest. If anything, it has amplified it. Every unexplored valley, every unusual geological formation, every fragment of an old account becomes another piece of a puzzle that refuses to reveal its full picture. And so the Mongolian steppe remains silent. Beneath its windswept hills and remote mountains, the answer may still rest exactly where it was placed centuries ago, untouched, unseen, and waiting. Whether the tomb will ever be found, or whether it was meant to remain hidden forever, is a question that continues to linger across the landscape itself. If the hidden grave of Genghis Khan reminds us how entire chapters of history can disappear without a trace, the next mystery takes that idea even further. This time, it is not the location of a single tomb that has been lost, but the fate of an entire community. Far to the north, beyond the forests of Scandinavia and the rough seas of the North Atlantic, lies Greenland. For much of the year, the landscape appears almost otherworldly. Towering glaciers spill toward dark fjords. Icebergs drift silently through cold waters. Winds sweep across barren valleys where only sparse vegetation clings to the rocky ground. At first glance, it seems an unlikely place for medieval European settlements to survive. And yet, for centuries, they did. The story begins around the year 985, when the Norse explorer Eric the Red established colonies along Greenland's southwestern coast. Exiled from Iceland, he arrived in this remote land and encouraged others to follow. Despite the harsh environment, settlers built farms, churches, and communities. They raised livestock, traded valuable walrus ivory, and maintained connections with Europe across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. For generations, these colonies endured. Archaeological evidence reveals a surprisingly organized society. Stone churches stood where few would expect them. Farms dotted sheltered fjords. Written records describe bishops, marriages, and trade voyages. At their peak, the settlements may have supported several thousand people. Then, gradually, they vanished. The mystery is not that the colonies disappeared overnight. Rather, it is that no single explanation fully accounts for their fate. Historical documents provide only fragments of the story. The last known written record from the eastern settlement dates to 1408, describing a wedding at a church called Hvalsi. It is a remarkably ordinary event, the kind of record that suggests life was continuing much as it always had. Yet after that, silence. When later visitors reached Greenland, they found abandoned farms and empty churches. The Norse settlers were gone. What happened? The most widely accepted explanation involves climate change. During the period known as the Little Ice Age, temperatures across parts of the North Atlantic appear to have declined. Shorter growing seasons and harsher winters may have made farming increasingly difficult. Sea ice could have disrupted trade routes, isolating the colonies from Europe. Evidence supports this theory. Studies of ice cores, sediments, and archaeological remains suggest environmental conditions became more challenging over time. But was climate alone enough to erase centuries of settlement? Some researchers point to economic decline. The Greenland colonies depended heavily on trade, particularly in walrus ivory. As alternative sources of ivory became available and European markets changed, Greenland's economic importance may have diminished. Fewer ships arrived, supplies became scarcer, isolation deepened. Others focus on adaptation, or the lack of it. Archaeological findings suggest the Norse continued relying heavily on familiar European farming practices, even as conditions changed. Meanwhile, the Inuit populations living in the Arctic had developed techniques specifically suited to the environment, including specialized hunting methods and technologies for survival in extreme cold. Did the Norse fail to adapt quickly enough? Or is that interpretation too simple? The relationship between the Norse and Inuit remains another puzzle. Some evidence suggests contact occurred. Artifacts indicate possible trade and interaction. Medieval accounts contain references to encounters between the groups. Were those encounters peaceful, hostile, or something in between? The historical record offers few definitive answers. And then there are the more speculative possibilities. Some theories suggest groups of settlers may have abandoned Greenland entirely, sailing westward toward unknown lands. After all, Norse explorers had already reached parts of North America centuries before Columbus. Could small communities have migrated and merged into distant populations, leaving little trace behind? Others wonder whether disease played a role. Epidemics transformed countless societies throughout history, often leaving only fragmented evidence behind. In Greenland's harsh environment, even a modest population loss might have had dramatic consequences. A handful of fringe theories venture even further, proposing undiscovered settlements hidden in remote regions or lost records waiting to be uncovered. While evidence for such ideas remains limited, they persist because so many details of the disappearance remain uncertain. Today, the ruins still stand. Stone church walls overlook silent fjords. Foundations of farms emerge from the tundra. Weathered remnants of a medieval world remain frozen within the Arctic landscape. They are not hidden. They are visible, measurable, and carefully studied. And yet the final chapter of their story remains frustratingly incomplete. The people who built these settlements lived, worked, worshipped, and raised families on the edge of the known world. For nearly 500 years, they endured conditions that seem almost unimaginable today. Then, somehow, they faded from history. Perhaps the answer lies buried beneath another layer of ice, preserved in a forgotten settlement yet to be excavated. Perhaps it exists in records that have not survived the centuries. Or perhaps the truth is scattered across many small causes rather than one dramatic event. Standing among the ruins, looking across Greenland's cold and silent fjords, it becomes difficult not to wonder. When the last Norse settlers looked out across these same waters, what future did they see? And where did they ultimately go? If the fate of the Norse settlers leaves us wondering how entire communities can fade from history, our next mystery shifts from frozen fjords to a very different frontier, one no less vast and perhaps even more unforgiving. The Atlantic Ocean stretches beyond the horizon in every direction. Its surface can appear calm and inviting, reflecting the sun like polished glass. But beneath that tranquil appearance lies one of the most powerful and unpredictable environments on Earth. For centuries, sailors crossed these waters carrying goods, ideas, and ambitions. Many returned. Some never did. Among the most intriguing maritime mysteries is the story of a ruler who may have launched one of history's greatest voyages and then vanished beyond the edge of the known world. The story begins in the Mali Empire of West Africa during the early 14th century. At the time, Mali was one of the wealthiest and most influential states on the planet. Its territories controlled important trade routes across the Sahara. Gold flowed through its markets. Cities such as Timbuktu became centers of commerce, learning, and culture. Yet one of Mali's most fascinating stories concerns not wealth, but exploration. The account comes primarily from the famous pilgrimage of Mansa Musa, the emperor whose immense riches became legendary throughout the medieval world. During his journey to Mecca in 1324, Mansa Musa spoke with scholars and officials about how he had come to power. According to records preserved by the historian Al-Umari, Musa explained that his predecessor had become obsessed with discovering what lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean. That predecessor is often identified as Mansa Abu Bakr II. The story describes an ambitious experiment. The ruler reportedly assembled a fleet of hundreds of vessels and ordered them westward into the ocean. Only one ship returned. Its crew claimed they had encountered a powerful current in the open sea that swept the other vessels away. Most rulers might have accepted such a report as sufficient warning. But according to the account, Abu Bakr was not satisfied. Determined to learn the truth for himself, he supposedly organized an even larger expedition. This time, he personally joined the fleet. And then, he disappeared. No confirmed record describes what happened next. No known document reports his return. No verified wreckage has ever been linked to the expedition. The fleet simply passes out of history. For many historians, the most cautious interpretation focuses on the source itself. The account originates from Mansa Musa's own explanation of how he inherited power. While many scholars consider the story plausible, details remain difficult to verify independently. The exact size of the fleet, the identity of its leader, and the scale of the voyage are all subjects of debate. Yet the mystery persists because the core question remains unanswered. What became of the expedition? One possibility is straightforward. The Atlantic is immense, and medieval ships faced enormous risks. Storms, navigation errors, equipment failures, and dwindling supplies could have doomed even a well-prepared fleet. If the vessels were lost at sea, physical evidence may now rest thousands of meters beneath the ocean surface. Another possibility involves ocean currents themselves. Modern understanding of Atlantic circulation reveals pathways that can carry vessels from West Africa toward the Americas. Some researchers have noted that such routes are not impossible for pre-Columbian sailors to navigate, intentionally or otherwise. Could part of the fleet have crossed the ocean? The question has inspired decades of speculation. A number of theories suggest that survivors may have reached the Americas long before Columbus. Advocates point to scattered cultural similarities, contested interpretations of artifacts, or accounts recorded centuries later. However, definitive archaeological evidence supporting a large-scale Malian presence in the Americas remains elusive. The absence of clear proof has not ended the debate. Instead, it has deepened the mystery. Other theories remain closer to Africa. Perhaps the expedition reached distant islands and never returned. Perhaps it encountered unexpected lands but lacked the resources to maintain contact. Perhaps some ships survived while others vanished, creating stories that were gradually absorbed into legend. Even the fleet itself raises questions. How advanced were the vessels? How prepared were they for open ocean navigation? Medieval West African maritime technology remains an area of active study, and many aspects of long-distance seafaring in the region are still being explored by researchers. In some ways, the mystery reflects a larger challenge within history itself. Countless achievements, journeys, and discoveries may have occurred without leaving records that survived the centuries. Entire chapters of the human story can disappear through war, climate, decay, or simple chance. Today, the Atlantic continues its endless motion. Waves roll westward as they did 700 years ago. Powerful currents flow across the ocean basin, connecting continents while concealing what may lie beneath. Somewhere beneath those waters, there may be traces of a voyage that changed lives, kingdoms, and destinies. Or perhaps the answers were lost long ago, carried away by the same currents that drew the fleet toward the horizon. As the ocean keeps its silence, one question remains suspended between history and possibility. When Mansa Abu Bakr II sailed into the Atlantic and vanished from the record, did his expedition meet disaster in the open sea, or did it reach a destination no one was ever meant to know about? If the mystery of Mansa Abu Bakr II asks what became of a vanished expedition, the next mystery presents an equally difficult question. What happens when the evidence survives, but its meaning disappears? Unlike lost ships, forgotten cities, or missing tombs, this enigma sits in plain sight. It can be photographed, studied, and examined page by page. Yet after centuries of investigation, no one can say with certainty who created it, why it was written, or what it truly contains. It is known simply as the Voynich Manuscript. Resting today in a climate-controlled archive, The manuscript appears, at first glance, like many other medieval books. Its pages are made of vellum, carefully prepared animal skin. Brown ink forms lines of elegant handwriting across each sheet. Delicate illustrations fill the margins and sections of text. But the closer one looks, the stranger it becomes. The plants depicted within the manuscript seem unfamiliar. Some resemble real species, while others appear to combine features from multiple plants into forms that do not exist. Elsewhere, diagrams of stars, moons, and circular patterns spread across fold-out pages. Certain illustrations show groups of women standing or floating within elaborate networks of tubes, pools, and structures whose purpose remains unclear. Most puzzling of all is the writing itself. The manuscript is filled with thousands of words written in a script found nowhere else on Earth. No known language matches it. No confirmed translation exists. And despite decades of effort, the identity of its author, or authors, remains unknown. Modern scientific testing has established some important facts. Radiocarbon dating places the vellum in the early 15th century, roughly between 1404 and 1438. The inks and pigments are generally consistent with materials available during that period. These findings suggest that the manuscript is not a modern forgery, as some once suspected. The object itself appears genuinely old, yet its origins remain remarkably obscure. The manuscript takes its modern name from Wilfrid Voynich, the rare book dealer who acquired it in 1912. Since then, linguists, historians, cryptographers, mathematicians, and computer scientists have all attempted to unlock its secrets. Many believed the text must be a cipher. After all, history contains numerous examples of encoded writing used to conceal political, religious, or scientific information. During the 20th century, some of the world's leading code breakers examined the manuscript, including experts who had successfully deciphered military communications during wartime. They failed. This failure alone transformed the manuscript into something extraordinary. Could an unknown medieval author have created a cipher so sophisticated that modern experts still cannot solve it? Perhaps. Yet alternative explanations emerged. Some scholars argue that the text may represent a real but undocumented language. Statistical analyses have revealed patterns that resemble natural human languages. Certain words appear with predictable frequencies. Repeated structures suggest underlying grammatical rules. The text does not seem entirely random. If it is a language, whose language is it? Where was it spoken? And why has no other example survived? Other researchers have proposed that the manuscript could be a highly specialized medical, botanical, or alchemical text written for a small community. Medieval Europe was home to numerous secretive traditions, scholarly circles, and esoteric schools of thought. Could the manuscript belong to one of these forgotten worlds? Then there are the more speculative possibilities. Some theories suggest the manuscript was an elaborate hoax designed to deceive wealthy collectors or patrons. Yet creating hundreds of pages of consistent text would have required an astonishing amount of effort for a joke whose purpose remains unclear. Others wonder whether the book represents knowledge intentionally concealed from broader society. A few fringe interpretations even propose that its symbols encode information using methods far ahead of their time. There are theories involving lost civilizations, hidden scientific traditions, and forgotten networks of scholars whose records have vanished from history. None have been conclusively proven. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the mystery is not what the manuscript says, but what its existence implies. Someone spent years creating it. Someone understood the symbols. Someone knew how to read every page. The manuscript was not mysterious to its creator. It was meaningful. It communicated something specific to someone. Yet the chain connecting author and reader has somehow been broken. Across 6 centuries, wars have been fought, Kingdoms have risen and fallen, and entire libraries have disappeared. Through it all, the manuscript survived. The words remain exactly where they were written, waiting silently upon the vellum. And that silence may be the greatest mystery of all, because somewhere in the distant past, an individual sat beneath candlelight and carefully filled these pages with purpose and intent. They likely never imagined a future in which thousands of researchers would examine their work without understanding a single sentence. The book remains open. The illustrations remain visible. The text remains intact. And still, one question lingers over every page. Who were the people behind the Voynich manuscript? And what knowledge vanished with them when their voices disappeared from history? If the Voynich manuscript leaves us wondering how knowledge can survive while its meaning is lost, the next mystery asks a different question. What happens when the knowledge itself disappears? Throughout history, civilizations have preserved their greatest achievements in libraries. Within their walls, generations stored discoveries, histories, philosophies, and observations of the world. Yet libraries are fragile things. A single fire, invasion, or political upheaval can erase centuries of accumulated understanding. Few places illustrate this more powerfully than Constantinople. At dawn, sunlight reflects across the waters of the Bosporus. The city rises between continents, its hills crowned by towers, domes, and ancient stone walls. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople stood at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, serving as the capital of the Byzantine Empire and one of the most important centers of learning in the medieval world. Merchants arrived from distant lands. Scholars copied manuscripts in candlelit rooms. Diplomats, travelers, and theologians carried ideas through its gates. Within this vast network of knowledge stood collections of texts whose contents may never be fully known again. Among them was what historians often refer to as the Imperial Library of Constantinople. Its origins reach back to the 4th century, when the city emerged as the new capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Recognizing the importance of preserving classical learning, imperial officials collected and copied manuscripts from across the ancient world. Works of philosophy, science, literature, history, and law were gathered and stored. At a time when many ancient texts existed only as fragile handwritten copies, such efforts were essential. Without them, entire traditions of knowledge could vanish. Historical sources suggest that the library contained thousands of manuscripts. Some scholars believe it played a crucial role in preserving works from classical Greece and Rome that might otherwise have disappeared during periods of turmoil. Yet the story of the library is not one of uninterrupted survival. It is a story of repeated loss. Fires struck the city more than once. Political conflicts disrupted institutions. Wars reshaped the empire. Each crisis threatened the collections housed within Constantinople's walls. One particularly significant event occurred in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. Crusader forces captured and looted the city, causing widespread destruction. Contemporary accounts describe treasures carried away, buildings damaged, and cultural losses that would echo through the centuries. How many manuscripts disappeared during those chaotic days? No one knows. Some were undoubtedly destroyed. Others may have been stolen and dispersed throughout Europe. A few perhaps survived in private collections, their origins forgotten over time. Then came another defining moment. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire after a historic siege. The event marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and transformed the city forever. While many scholars and manuscripts had already migrated westward in previous centuries, questions remain about what still existed within the city's collections at the time of its fall. Were priceless texts lost during the transition? Did unknown works survive in hidden archives? Or had much of the library already vanished long before the final siege? The uncertainty creates fertile ground for mystery. Mainstream historians generally agree that no single catastrophic event erased the library in one dramatic moment. Instead, its decline likely occurred gradually over centuries through neglect, warfare, dispersal, and changing political circumstances. Yet the gaps in the historical record leave room for speculation. Some researchers have wondered whether forgotten caches of manuscripts may still exist. Throughout history, valuable texts were often concealed during times of danger. Monasteries, private estates, underground chambers, and remote religious communities sometimes protected works that larger institutions could not. Could undiscovered collections remain hidden somewhere, their contents untouched for centuries? Others point to references in medieval writings that describe texts no longer known to survive. Certain ancient works are mentioned by authors who clearly had access to them, yet no complete copies exist today. What became of those manuscripts? Were they destroyed, or are they waiting somewhere beyond the reach of current scholarship? More speculative theories go even further. Some suggest the library may have contained lost scientific knowledge, forgotten maps, or historical accounts capable of reshaping our understanding of the ancient world. While evidence for such claims remains limited, they endure because the scale of what has been lost is impossible to measure precisely. After all, it is difficult to calculate the value of information that no longer exists. Today, modern Istanbul stands atop layers of history stretching back thousands of years. Beneath its streets lie remnants of empires, churches, palaces, and forgotten structures. Archaeologists continue to uncover surprises hidden beneath the city. Each discovery serves as a reminder that the past is rarely as complete as we imagine. Somewhere within the long history of Constantinople, countless voices once recorded their thoughts on parchment and ink. Philosophers debated ideas, historians chronicled events, scholars preserved knowledge they believed future generations would inherit. Many of those voices reached us, others did not. And perhaps that is the true mystery of the lost library of Constantinople. Not merely what was destroyed, but what might still be missing from humanity's understanding of its own past, waiting silently in some overlooked archive, hidden chamber, or forgotten page yet to be found. If the lost library of Constantinople reminds us that entire collections of knowledge can vanish into history, the next mystery begins with something even more elusive, a place that countless people searched for, mapped, and wrote about, yet may have existed only in fragments of truth and imagination. For centuries, explorers believed it was real. Kings hoped to find it. Scholars debated its location. Cartographers carefully marked it on maps. And yet, no one could agree on where it actually was. This is the mystery of the kingdom of Prester Joan. Imagine a distant land beyond the edge of the known world. Vast rivers flow through fertile valleys. Magnificent cities rise above the landscape. Wealth beyond measure fills royal treasuries. Strange animals roam untamed wilderness. At its center rules a powerful Christian monarch, whose authority extends across enormous territories. At least, that is how medieval Europe imagined it. The story first emerged during the 12th century, a period when much of the world beyond Europe remained poorly understood by Western scholars. Information traveled slowly. Travelers' accounts mixed observation with rumor. Geography often blurred into legend. Within this environment, stories began circulating about a mysterious ruler known as Prester John. The title itself combined religious and royal authority. Prester derived from the word for priest, suggesting a leader who was both king and spiritual figure. Reports described him as a powerful Christian monarch ruling somewhere far beyond the Islamic powers that dominated many trade routes and territories of the era. To medieval Europeans, the tale carried enormous significance. At a time of religious conflict and political uncertainty, the possibility of a powerful allied kingdom hidden somewhere in the East was deeply appealing. Then came one of history's most intriguing documents. Around the mid-12th century, a letter began circulating throughout Europe. Purportedly written by Prester John himself, it described a kingdom filled with astonishing wonders. The letter spoke of rivers carrying precious stones, exotic creatures, immense wealth, and miraculous landscapes. Copies spread rapidly. Many believed it. Others were skeptical. Today, historians generally regard the letter as a fabrication. Yet its influence was extraordinary. For generations, it shaped European perceptions of distant lands and fueled the search for the mysterious kingdom. The question was simple. Where was Prester John's realm? The answers changed constantly. Early theories placed the kingdom somewhere in Asia. This made sense to many medieval scholars. Reports of powerful Eastern rulers, combined with limited knowledge of Central Asia and beyond, created fertile ground for speculation. Some associated Prester John with distant Christian communities known to exist in parts of Asia. Others connected the legend to reports emerging from the Mongol Empire during its rapid expansion across Eurasia. As explorers gathered new information, the location shifted. Gradually, attention turned toward Africa. Particularly intriguing was Ethiopia, one of the world's oldest Christian kingdoms. European travelers encountering accounts of Ethiopia found similarities that seemed to echo elements of the Prester John legend. Diplomatic contacts between Europe and Ethiopia further strengthened the connection. For centuries, many maps labeled regions of Africa as the domain of Prester John. Yet even this explanation remained incomplete. The actual rulers of Ethiopia were real historical figures with well-documented traditions and political structures. They were not the mythical monarch described in the legendary accounts. So how did the connection emerge? Was it simply a misunderstanding created by distant observers trying to fit unfamiliar realities into familiar stories? Or had fragments of genuine information become transformed through centuries of retelling? Many historians believe the legend developed from a combination of factors: rumors of distant Christian kingdoms, exaggerated travel accounts, misunderstandings between cultures, and the medieval tendency to blend fact with wonder. Yet some aspects remain surprisingly difficult to trace. Who first created the story? What inspired the famous letter? Why did so many educated people accept its claims for so long? The mystery becomes even more fascinating when viewed through the lens of medieval psychology. Prester John represented more than a location. He embodied hope. The legend offered the possibility that beyond known frontiers existed allies, knowledge, and resources waiting to be discovered. In that sense, the kingdom became a destination for the imagination, as much as for explorers. More speculative theories occasionally suggest that the legend may preserve distorted memories of real but poorly documented states or religious communities that have since disappeared from the historical record. Others wonder whether unidentified sources influenced the narrative before being lost to time. Evidence remains limited, but the questions persist. Perhaps that persistence explains why the mystery has endured for nearly 1,000 years. Unlike a lost city that can be excavated, or a shipwreck that can be recovered, Prester John's kingdom occupies a more uncertain space between history and legend. It exists within old letters, faded maps, travelers' tales, and centuries of human curiosity. The search for the kingdom ultimately revealed far more about those seeking it than about the land itself. Yet somewhere beneath the myths may still lie fragments of forgotten encounters, misunderstood kingdoms, and real places that inspired extraordinary stories. And as we follow those traces through the medieval world, we are left with a question that has never been fully answered. Was the kingdom of Prester John merely one of history's greatest legends? Or does its enduring shadow point toward a reality that has yet to be completely uncovered? If the kingdom of Prester John blurs the boundary between reality and belief, the next mystery takes us into a place where that boundary may have vanished entirely, not on a distant map, but in the minds of ordinary people. Some mysteries leave behind ruins, manuscripts, or forgotten cities. Others leave only eyewitness accounts and a question that seems almost impossible to answer. What could cause hundreds, perhaps even thousands of people to dance against their will? The summer air hangs heavily over the medieval towns along the Rhine River. Narrow streets wind between timber-framed houses. Church bells echo across crowded marketplaces. Farmers arrive with carts of grain. Merchants barter over goods brought from distant regions. Life appears ordinary. Then, suddenly, something begins to happen. A handful of people step into the streets and start dancing. At first, the behavior seems unusual but harmless. Yet the dancing does not stop. Hours pass. The movements continue. The dancers appear unable or unwilling to rest. As days pass, more people join them. Soon, entire groups are moving through the streets in an almost continuous trance. This was the beginning of what historians now call the Dancing Mania of 1374. The outbreak is among the earliest and best documented examples of a phenomenon that would appear repeatedly across parts of medieval Europe. Contemporary chronicles describe large groups of people dancing uncontrollably through towns and villages, often for extended periods. Witnesses reported scenes that were both bewildering and disturbing. Participants danced until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some cried out in distress. Others appeared detached from their surroundings. Many seemed unable to control their actions. Observers described people leaping, spinning, and convulsing in public spaces, while crowds gathered to watch. The event spread across regions that now include parts of Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. How could such behavior move from one community to another? Why did so many individuals appear affected? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly was happening? The historical record provides enough detail to confirm that something unusual occurred. Multiple contemporary accounts describe outbreaks of compulsive dancing. Church authorities, civic leaders, and physicians all took notice. Yet agreement ends there. The causes remain deeply uncertain. One of the most widely discussed explanations involves what modern psychologists call mass psychogenic illness, sometimes referred to as mass hysteria. Under this interpretation, extreme social stress may have played a crucial role. The 14th century was a difficult era. Europe had endured famine, war, economic instability, and the devastating effects of the Black Death. Entire communities had experienced profound loss and uncertainty. Anxiety and fear were woven into everyday life. Could intense psychological pressure have manifested collectively through physical behavior? Many scholars believe this possibility deserves serious consideration. In societies where religious beliefs shaped nearly every aspect of life, unusual behavior was often interpreted through spiritual frameworks. Some participants reportedly believed they were affected by supernatural forces or divine punishment. Others associated the phenomenon with saints whose influence was thought to affect physical movement and health. Within that cultural context, expectations themselves may have influenced how people responded. Yet not everyone finds psychological explanations entirely satisfying. Another theory points toward ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that can infect rye and other grains, producing compounds that affect the nervous system. In certain circumstances, consumption of contaminated food can cause hallucinations, muscle spasms, and unusual behavior. At first glance, the theory appears promising. However, many researchers note significant problems. The symptoms associated with severe ergot poisoning often make sustained dancing physically difficult. In addition, the geographic spread and duration of the outbreaks do not always align neatly with known patterns of contamination. The explanation remains possible in some cases, but few historians view it as a complete answer. The mystery deepens when examining the behavior itself. Accounts frequently describe participants entering altered states of consciousness. Some claimed to experience visions. Others reported heightened emotional reactions or unusual sensory experiences. Certain chroniclers noted that music seemed to influence the dancers, though reports vary considerably. Were these descriptions accurate? Were observers interpreting unfamiliar behavior through the lens of medieval beliefs? Or do they point toward aspects of the phenomenon that remain poorly understood? More speculative theories have emerged over the centuries. Some suggest the outbreaks may have involved forgotten religious rituals that gradually escaped institutional control. Others wonder whether social tensions, collective trauma, and cultural expectations combined in ways that modern observers struggle to fully appreciate. A few interpretations venture into more mysterious territory, proposing influences that lie beyond conventional historical explanation. While evidence for such claims remains limited, they persist because the documented events themselves seem so extraordinary. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Dancing Mania is that it occurred in public. These were not isolated incidents witnessed by a single observer. Entire communities saw people dancing through streets, marketplaces, and public squares. Officials recorded it. Clergy responded to it. Chroniclers preserved accounts of it. Something happened. Yet centuries later, no consensus explanation has emerged. Today, the medieval towns where these events unfolded appear quiet and ordinary. The marketplaces remain. The rivers continue to flow past ancient streets. Visitors walk through locations where, according to historical records, crowds once watched as neighbors and strangers danced for reasons no one could fully explain. The documents survive. The reports remain. The questions endure. And perhaps that is what makes the Dancing Mania of 1374 so haunting. Unlike a lost kingdom or a vanished library, this mystery concerns human behavior itself. It forces us to consider how little we may still understand about the relationship between belief, emotion, culture, and the mind. Because somewhere in those crowded medieval streets, hundreds of people shared an experience powerful enough to spread across entire regions. Whether it was psychological, biological, social, spiritual, or some combination of all four remains uncertain. And as the centuries pass, one question continues to echo through the historical record. What invisible force moved so many people to dance when every instinct should have told them to stop? If the Dancing Mania of 1374 reveals how fragile the human mind can become under pressure, then the next mystery shifts from the internal world of behavior to something far more tangible, something believed to have been carried in secret, hidden in mountains, and then lost to history in a single night of fire and silence. In the foothills of the French Pyrenees, the landscape rises into jagged peaks and deep valleys. Mist clings to the stone in the early morning, softening the edges of cliffs that once held villages, fortresses, and forgotten strongholds. Among these heights stands Montségur, a ruined fortress perched on a narrow rocky spur overlooking the valley below. Today, it is quiet. Wind moves through broken stone walls. Birds circle above ancient foundations. But in the 13th century, this place was anything but silent. It was here, according to historical accounts, that the final chapter of the Cathar story unfolded. The Cathars were a religious group that emerged in medieval southern Europe, particularly in the Languedoc region. Their beliefs diverged from mainstream Catholic doctrine, emphasizing spiritual purity, simplicity, and a dualistic view of good and evil. To their followers, the world was often seen as a place of suffering, and salvation was understood through spiritual awakening rather than material power. By the early 13th century, the Cathar movement had grown significantly, attracting both common people and members of local nobility. This growth, however, drew the attention of the Catholic Church, which viewed the movement as heretical. What followed was the Albigensian Crusade, a long and brutal campaign that reshaped the region through decades of conflict. Cities were besieged, communities were destroyed, entire populations were forced to choose between conversion and death. The historical record is clear on the scale of violence, but less certain about what was lost beyond lives and land. Because within Cathar tradition lies a persistent and enduring mystery, the fate of their treasure. By the early 1240s, the remaining Cathar strongholds were being steadily eliminated. Montségur became one of the last major refuges. The fortress, difficult to access and naturally defended by its cliffside position, held out for months under siege. Inside were Cathar leaders, defenders, and reportedly a group of individuals entrusted with something far more valuable than gold alone. What exactly that treasure was remains one of history's most debated questions. Some accounts describe material wealth, gold, silver, and precious objects collected to support the community or fund escape routes. In a time of siege, such resources would have been critical for survival or negotiation. But other interpretations suggest something less material and far more enigmatic. Medieval sources and later traditions hint at sacred texts, religious artifacts, or teachings preserved by the Cathars. Some writers speculated that these could have included lost or alternative interpretations of Christian scripture, or knowledge passed down through secretive channels. And then there are the more speculative ideas. Over centuries, the Cathar treasure became intertwined with legends far beyond the historical record. Some later traditions linked it to sacred relics, hidden manuscripts, or symbolic objects representing spiritual authority. A few interpretations, emerging much later, even suggested connections to broader mythological narratives that have no confirmed historical grounding, yet continue to circulate in popular imagination. What is known with greater certainty is what happened at Montségur in 1244. After a long siege, the fortress finally fell. Historical accounts describe a mass surrender. Many Cathars were given a stark choice: renounce their beliefs or face death. A large number chose not to convert. They were taken outside the fortress walls and executed. But before this final moment, something notable occurred. Chroniclers and later storytellers alike describe a small group leaving the fortress under cover of night shortly before its surrender. These individuals are often said to have descended the mountain carrying unknown items. Whether they escaped successfully, and what they may have carried with them, remains unverified. No contemporary document clearly identifies what happened to them afterward. No definitive record confirms the contents of what they might have transported, and no archaeological discovery has ever resolved the question. This absence of clarity has allowed the mystery to grow over time. In the centuries that followed, local legends multiplied. Some spoke of hidden caches buried in caves scattered across the Pyrenees. Others described secret guardians protecting knowledge passed down through generations. Certain tales even suggested that whatever was removed from Montségur was hidden so carefully that it has never been rediscovered. Modern historians tend to approach these stories with caution. Many emphasize that the idea of a single, unified treasure may be a later interpretation imposed onto a more complex historical reality. The Cathar movement itself was diverse, and much of its material culture was likely destroyed during the Crusade. Yet the gaps in the record remain difficult to ignore. Why were certain individuals allegedly allowed to leave before the final surrender? What, if anything, did they carry with them? And why does the idea of a hidden Cathar treasure persist so strongly in historical memory, despite the lack of concrete evidence? The Pyrenees today remain rugged and vast. Caves and valleys still lie partially unexplored. Stone ruins mark the locations of forgotten settlements. Local traditions continue to reference hidden places in the landscape, though separating history from folklore is rarely straightforward. Perhaps the treasure was never a single object at all, but a collection of beliefs, texts, and cultural memory carried in fragments through time. Or perhaps it was something more physical, concealed in a way that has yet to be uncovered. Standing among the ruins of Montségur, it is difficult not to imagine the final moments within its walls, the choices made under pressure, the decisions taken in silence, and the possibility that something was carried away into the darkness of the mountains. And so the question remains, drifting through centuries of history and legend alike. When Montségur fell and the Cathar world came to an end, did its greatest secret truly disappear? Or is it still hidden somewhere in the shadowed valleys of the Pyrenees, waiting to be found? If the fate of the Cathar treasure lingers in the silence of mountain ruins, then the next mystery shifts us eastward, toward a city that once called itself the center of the world, where wealth was not hidden in caves or carried through night passes, but displayed in palaces of gold, marble, and light. Across the waters of the Bosporus, where Europe and Asia meet, the skyline of Constantinople once rose like a vision of imperial power. Domes shimmered above churches. Marble palaces reflected the sea. Markets overflowed with silk, spices, and relics gathered from across 3 continents. At the heart of this city stood the great palace of Constantinople, residence of Byzantine emperors and repository of some of the most extraordinary treasures of the medieval world. For nearly 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire preserved the legacy of Rome in the East. Within its imperial capital, wealth was not only a symbol of power, it was a language of authority. Crowns encrusted with jewels, golden thrones, sacred relics, and ceremonial regalia were used to reinforce the divine right of emperors who ruled from behind thick walls and elaborate rituals. But history tells us that such treasures do not remain untouched forever. The most significant rupture came in 1204. During the Fourth Crusade, a military expedition originally intended for the Holy Land was diverted, and Constantinople itself became the target. When the city fell, it did not simply change rulers, it was subjected to extensive looting. Contemporary accounts describe churches stripped of ornaments, palaces emptied of their contents, and sacred objects carried away by soldiers who had once sworn to defend Christian lands. The scale of what was taken is still difficult to fully reconstruct. Some artifacts were transported to Venice, where they remain visible today in cathedrals and collections. Others were dispersed across Europe, absorbed into private treasuries, monasteries, and royal hoards. Yet historians agree that what survives today is only a fraction of what once existed, because Constantinople did not lose its treasures in a single moment. It lost them in stages. After the Latin occupation, the Byzantine Empire eventually regained the city in 1261. Yet the empire that returned was weakened, its resources diminished, its institutions fragmented. The imperial treasury never fully recovered its former scale. Many artifacts had already disappeared into foreign hands or been melted down, repurposed, or forgotten. And still, questions remain. What exactly was lost? Written records refer to extraordinary objects that no longer exist in any known collection. Ceremonial crowns used in imperial coronations. Relics believed to carry sacred significance. Thrones and regalia associated with centuries of dynastic continuity. Some accounts even describe mechanical marvels, automata and intricate devices used in court ceremonies to project imperial authority through spectacle. Yet these descriptions often survive only in fragments. Chroniclers wrote of splendor that modern historians can only partially verify. So what became of the missing imperial treasures? One explanation is straightforward: destruction and dispersal. Wars, fires, and political upheaval over centuries would have gradually erased much of what remained. Precious metals would have been melted, jewels reset, religious objects redistributed or lost during transitions of power. But there are gaps in this explanation. Certain inventories referenced in medieval texts do not fully match surviving artifacts. Some objects appear in records and then vanish without clear trace. Others are described in such detail that their absence today feels almost conspicuous. This has led some researchers to explore alternative possibilities. Could portions of the imperial treasury have been hidden during moments of crisis? Constantinople endured sieges long before its final fall to the Ottoman Empire in 1453. In times of imminent danger, it would not have been unusual for valuable objects to be concealed within churches, underground chambers, or fortified structures. Yet if such caches were created, no confirmed discovery has ever revealed them in full. The fall of 1453 adds another layer of uncertainty. When the Ottoman forces breached the city's defenses, Constantinople once again underwent rapid transformation. Historical accounts describe further looting and redistribution of remaining wealth. Some treasures were absorbed into the emerging imperial system. Others disappeared from the historical record entirely. Did everything surface during those turbulent days? Or were some objects concealed so effectively that they never re-entered circulation? A number of speculative theories suggest that hidden vaults or sealed chambers may still exist beneath modern Istanbul. The city, built and rebuilt over millennia, contains layers of ancient infrastructure: tunnels, cisterns, foundations, and forgotten passageways. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal unexpected remnants of Byzantine architecture beneath modern streets. Could something still remain undiscovered? There are also theories that stretch further into the realm of speculation, suggesting that certain imperial objects may have been intentionally removed and transported far beyond the city, their origins obscured by time and distance. While such ideas are difficult to verify, they persist in part because of how fragmented the historical record has become. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of this mystery is not the scale of what was lost, but the silence surrounding it. Unlike treasures destroyed in a single catastrophic event, the Byzantine imperial wealth faded gradually, dispersed across centuries, absorbed into other worlds, and partially erased by the passage of time. And yet, fragments remain. A crown in a cathedral treasury, a reliquary in a museum collection, a ceremonial object whose origin is uncertain. Each piece offers a glimpse into a larger whole that can no longer be reconstructed with certainty. Walking through modern Istanbul, it is difficult not to feel the weight of what once stood here. Beneath the streets, layers of history still lie buried. Above them, the city continues to move, evolve, and rebuild itself as it has done for centuries. And so the question remains, suspended between history and archaeology. When Constantinople's empire faded and its imperial treasures were scattered across time, did they truly vanish? Or are they still hidden in fragments across the world, waiting for the moment when enough pieces are finally brought back together? If the missing imperial treasures of Constantinople fade into fragments scattered across centuries and continents, then the next mystery pulls us away from empires entirely and into something far smaller in scale, but no less unsettling in its implications. In the quiet countryside of medieval England, near the village of Woolpit in Suffolk, the landscape is soft and green. Fields stretch outward under an open sky, divided by hedgerows and narrow dirt paths. In summer, the air carries the scent of crops and earth. It is an unremarkable place at first glance, ordinary, even peaceful. And yet, according to one of medieval England's most enduring accounts, something extraordinary was once discovered here. The story comes from 12th century chroniclers Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, who recorded a strange event said to have taken place during harvest time. While villagers worked in the fields near Woolpit, they reportedly discovered 2 children wandering near a pit used to trap wolves. At first, nothing about the scene seemed entirely unusual, until they looked more closely. The children were said to have green-tinted skin. Their clothing was unfamiliar, Their speech was incomprehensible. They appeared frightened, disoriented, and unwilling or unable to communicate in any known language. According to the accounts, they were taken into the village, where attempts were made to feed them and understand where they had come from. But the mystery deepened. The children reportedly refused most food offered to them until they encountered green beans or similar vegetation, which they consumed eagerly. Over time, their condition changed. Their skin tone gradually faded from green to a more natural appearance, and they began to learn the local language. The boy, according to the chronicles, became ill and died not long after. The girl survived, adapted, and eventually integrated into local society. She is said to have explained, in fragments, that she and her brother came from a place where the sun did not shine directly, and everything appeared in a greenish light. Then she said something even more puzzling. She described crossing a river or passage and suddenly finding herself in an unfamiliar land. And after that, no further explanation is clearly preserved in the historical record. The story, preserved in medieval Latin texts, has fascinated historians, folklorists, and researchers for centuries. Yet, like many accounts from the medieval period, it exists in a space where observation, interpretation, and imagination overlap. What exactly did the chroniclers witness, or believe they witnessed? Mainstream historical interpretation often approaches the story with caution. Some scholars suggest the account may be a symbolic or allegorical tale, reflecting medieval storytelling traditions rather than literal events. Others propose it could be based on real individuals who were misunderstood due to illness, malnutrition, or cultural displacement. One common hypothesis is that the children may have come from a remote or isolated community, possibly orphaned miners' children or individuals who had traveled from a distant region where language and customs were unfamiliar to the villagers of Woolpit. Miscommunication, combined with the limitations of medieval understanding, could have transformed an unusual encounter into something more mysterious over time. The mention of green skin has also prompted medical speculation. Some researchers suggest conditions such as hypochromic anemia or dietary deficiencies could, in rare cases, affect skin coloration, especially in malnourished children. Exposure to certain environmental factors or ingestion of specific plants might also have contributed to unusual physical appearances that were later exaggerated in retelling. Yet none of these explanations fully account for the more enigmatic details of the story. The children's reported inability to identify their origin, the description of a place where light itself was different, and the persistent suggestion that they did not recognize the world around them as familiar. These elements have allowed the legend to extend far beyond a simple local anecdote. Over time, more speculative interpretations have emerged. Some folklorists have suggested that the story may represent a distorted memory of contact with a culturally isolated group, filtered through medieval imagination. Others have explored the possibility that the tale encodes symbolic themes about innocence, displacement, or the unknown boundaries of the medieval world. There are even interpretations that place the story within broader mythological frameworks, suggesting that the children may represent figures from a parallel world motif common in European folklore, where beings occasionally cross between realms under unclear circumstances. While such ideas remain outside conventional historical methodology, they persist because the story itself resists easy classification. Unlike many legends that grow increasingly elaborate over time, the account of Woolpit remains relatively simple in its earliest recorded forms. 2 children, a village, a mystery that no one fully resolved. Modern Woolpit bears little resemblance to the world described in the chronicles. The village has evolved, its landscape shaped by centuries of agricultural change. Yet the story remains part of its identity, preserved in local memory and historical discussion. Visitors can still walk the fields where the children were said to have appeared. The ground is quiet now. The pits have long since disappeared. The farmland stretches uninterrupted toward the horizon, and yet, beneath that ordinary surface, the question remains. Who were the green children of Woolpit? Were they misunderstood travelers, victims of circumstance, or participants in a forgotten episode of medieval life later transformed into legend? Or does the persistence of certain details suggest that something more unusual was witnessed, something that has not been fully explained by the historical record we possess today? The chronicles end without resolution. The children's origins remain unrecorded. And as the fields of Suffolk continue to change with each passing season, one quiet question lingers beneath the English soil. Did two lost children once arrive in Woolpit from a distant, unknown place? Or did medieval eyes simply glimpse something they could never fully understand? If the green children of Woolpit blur the line between encounter and imagination, the next mystery shifts once again, from rural England's quiet fields to a place that may no longer exist on any modern map, except in fragments of memory, legend, and contested history. Along the southern shores of the Baltic Sea, where cold waters meet shifting coastlines of sand, marsh, and shallow bays, medieval chroniclers once described a prosperous port city. Ships are said to have crowded its harbors. Merchants from distant lands traded amber, salt, and cloth within its markets. Church bells reportedly echoed across its skyline, mingling with the sounds of seafarers arriving from across northern Europe. This city was called Vineta. At least, that is how later medieval and early modern sources remembered it. Unlike many historical cities that can be traced through archaeological remains or continuous records, Vineta exists in a more uncertain space. Some historians associate the legend with real medieval trading centers along the southern Baltic coast, possibly connected to the region inhabited by Slavic and Viking-era communities during the early Middle Ages. These coastal settlements were part of a dynamic network of trade, where cultures met, exchanged goods, and sometimes collided. But Vineta, as described in legend, was more than a trading port. It was said to be one of the richest cities of its time. Accounts that appear centuries later describe streets paved with stone, towers rising above bustling docks, and merchants so wealthy that gold and silver were commonplace in daily exchange. Some versions of the story even suggest that Vineta rivaled or surpassed other major medieval trade centers in prosperity. Yet, according to legend, it did not last. One of the most persistent versions of the tale tells of a city that grew so wealthy and so morally distant from surrounding societies that it drew divine punishment. In some accounts, warnings were ignored. In others, the city's inhabitants became consumed by excess and pride. Then, in a single catastrophic moment, the sea rose or the waters turned against it, and Vineta vanished beneath the waves. But what lies beneath legend, and what belongs to memory? Historical investigation into Vineta often begins with a more grounded approach. Scholars frequently point to real medieval cities such as Jumne, also recorded as Jomsborg in some sources, or Wolin, located in present-day Poland. These settlements were significant trade hubs during the early Middle Ages and were known to both Scandinavian and Slavic cultures. Over time, as political landscapes shifted and coastal geography changed, memories of these places may have blended into a single legendary identity. Coastal erosion, flooding, and changing river mouths in the Baltic region have also played a role in shaping speculation. Archaeological evidence confirms that settlements along these shores were sometimes abandoned, relocated, or partially submerged due to environmental changes. In a landscape defined by water, sand, and shifting tides, the boundary between land and sea was never fully stable. Could Vineta, then, be a memory of multiple cities rather than a single one? A composite of real places, gradually merged through storytelling? Yet the legend of Vineta does not behave like a simple historical record. Medieval chronicles and later writings often describe it with strikingly vivid and consistent imagery. A wealthy maritime city that disappears suddenly, sometimes described as sinking into the sea during a storm or divine judgment. Travelers' tales from the Middle Ages recount sightings of ruins beneath the water or bells ringing beneath the waves on calm days, though such descriptions are clearly symbolic or folkloric in nature. Still, the persistence of these motifs raises questions. Why does the idea of a submerged city endure so strongly in the Baltic cultural imagination? Some interpretations suggest that Vineta represents a moral narrative, a cautionary tale about wealth, excess, and impermanence. In this reading, the city functions less as a historical location and more as a symbolic lesson passed through generations of coastal communities who lived in close relationship with the sea's unpredictability. Others, however, consider whether fragments of real historical memory lie beneath the story. Could there have been a major trading center partially lost to coastal changes or catastrophic flooding, whose remnants were gradually obscured by time? The Baltic Sea region has undergone significant environmental shifts over centuries, and archaeological discoveries continue to reveal submerged structures, old harbor installations, and remnants of settlements beneath shallow waters. Yet none have been definitively identified as Vineta. The absence of a confirmed site has allowed the legend to expand beyond geography. In some medieval maps and writings, Vineta appears alongside real cities, treated as though it once held equal importance. In later centuries, Romantic historians and folklorists elevated it further, transforming it into a symbol of lost grandeur beneath the sea. And so the question becomes less about a single city and more about the relationship between history and memory itself. What transforms a real place into a legend that outlives its physical traces? Some researchers propose that Vineta may represent the collective memory of multiple coastal cities affected by trade decline, warfare, and environmental change during the transition from the early to high Middle Ages. As populations shifted and harbors were abandoned, stories of prosperity and loss could have merged into a single narrative of disappearance. Others suggest that oral traditions preserved echoes of real events, storms, floods, or gradual submersion of low-lying settlements that were later amplified into the image of a city swallowed by the sea. More speculative interpretations venture further, imagining Vineta not as a single historical place at all, but as a mythological reflection of humanity's recurring fear of impermanence, that even the most prosperous civilizations can vanish without warning, leaving only stories behind. Today, beneath the waters of the Baltic, sonar surveys and underwater archaeology continue to reveal traces of ancient human activity. Wooden structures, stone foundations, and scattered artifacts occasionally emerge from the seabed, offering glimpses into a submerged past that is still being reconstructed piece by piece. Yet none of these discoveries have fully resolved the question of Vineta. Walking along the modern Baltic coastline, it is difficult to distinguish where legend begins and history ends. The sea stretches outward, calm on some days, restless on others, continually reshaping the land it touches. Beneath its surface lies a vast archive of human activity, some known, much unknown. And so Vineta remains suspended between memory and map, between story and archaeology. Was it a single city lost to the sea in a forgotten catastrophe? A reflection of multiple real settlements absorbed into legend? Or something else entirely? An enduring image created by generations who lived alongside a coastline that never stopped changing? The waters of the Baltic offer no answer. Only silence, shifting tides, and the faint possibility that something still lies beneath, waiting to be understood. If Vineta dissolves into legend beneath the waters of the Baltic, then the next mystery carries us from submerged cities to open horizons, where the greatest uncertainty is not what lies below the surface, but what may have vanished into the vast, uncharted distances of the sea itself. Somewhere beyond the familiar coasts of Europe, where medieval maps once ended in blank spaces marked by dragons, storms, and speculation, sailors spoke of voyages that pushed beyond the limits of known navigation. These were waters where compasses behaved unpredictably, where weather could change without warning, and where entire expeditions could simply fail to return. Among these maritime mysteries, few are as elusive as the story of the Vivaldi brothers' lost expedition. The tale begins in the late 13th century, a period when European maritime exploration was still limited by technology, knowledge, and the sheer uncertainty of the open ocean. Genoa, a powerful maritime republic, had already established itself as a center of trade and navigation. Its ships carried goods across the Mediterranean, and its sailors were beginning to look beyond traditional routes. It was in this environment that two brothers, Ugolino and Vadino Vivaldi, reportedly set out on an extraordinary journey. Their destination, according to surviving records, was not a familiar port or well-charted coastline. Instead, they aimed to sail beyond the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Atlantic Ocean, seeking a route to the riches of Asia by sea, a concept that, at the time, existed more as ambition than established reality. In 1291, their expedition departed with 2 galleys, and then, according to history, they disappeared. The earliest accounts of their voyage come from Genoese chronicles, which record the departure of the brothers and their crews. These texts suggest that the expedition was well prepared, outfitted for a long journey into unknown waters. After leaving the Mediterranean, however, no reliable contemporary record confirms their return. What follows is not a clear narrative, but a series of fragments. A later account, written years after the expedition, claims that the Vivaldi brothers reached the Atlantic coast of Africa and continued southward. Another source suggests they may have attempted to round the continent long before Portuguese explorers achieved that feat centuries later. Yet none of these reports can be independently verified. The ocean, in this case, becomes both setting and silence. Unlike lost cities or buried treasures, maritime expeditions leave few traces when they vanish. Ships are swallowed by storms, currents disperse debris, and time erases most physical evidence. What remains are documents, often incomplete, sometimes contradictory, and always open to interpretation. So, what might have happened to the Vivaldi expedition? One of the most grounded explanations is straightforward: maritime failure. Medieval ships, even those considered advanced for their time, faced immense risks on open ocean voyages. Navigation beyond coastal waters was still developing, and storms in the Atlantic could easily overwhelm vessels unprepared for such conditions. A lost bearing, a failed supply chain, or unexpected weather could have ended the voyage far from any recorded shore. Yet this explanation, while plausible, does not fully resolve the mystery, because the story does not end with silence alone. Centuries later, echoes of the Vivaldi expedition appear in unexpected places. Some medieval and early Renaissance sources refer to rumors of European sailors sighted far beyond known territories. Other accounts hint at distant encounters or reports of ships seen in regions well outside expected trade routes. These references are sparse, indirect, and often written long after the events they describe. Still, they contribute to the lingering sense that the expedition's fate may not be entirely lost to history. Could the brothers have reached distant shores? Some historians have cautiously entertained the possibility that they may have ventured along the West African coast, perhaps interacting with regions that were not fully documented in European records at the time. Trade networks in Africa were already extensive and complex, and it is possible that encounters occurred without leaving surviving written accounts in European archives. Other theories extend even further, though they remain highly speculative. Some suggest the expedition may have been carried far off course by Atlantic currents, potentially reaching unknown lands. These ideas often intersect with broader debates about pre-modern transoceanic contact, though no definitive evidence has confirmed such a journey in the case of the Vivaldi brothers. There are also interpretations that place the expedition within the realm of symbolic or exploratory mythology. In this view, the Vivaldi voyage represents not just a historical event, but a turning point in the medieval imagination, the moment when Europe began to seriously confront the possibility of a world larger than its maps could accurately describe. Medieval cartography itself reflects this uncertainty. Maps from the period often blend real geography with imagined regions, leaving vast areas of the ocean undefined or filled with symbolic representations. In such a world, an expedition into the Atlantic was not merely a physical journey, but a step into conceptual unknowns. And yet, the absence of closure remains the most compelling aspect of the story. No confirmed wreckage has ever been identified. No definitive record describes the final moments of the expedition. No recovered artifacts can be directly linked to the Vivaldi brothers' ships. Only silence persists across the centuries. Modern oceanography has revealed more about the Atlantic than medieval sailors could ever have imagined. Its currents, depths, and weather systems now mapped in extraordinary detail. And yet even today, the ocean retains its capacity for disappearance. Ships can still vanish. Debris can still drift beyond detection. Entire histories can still be lost beneath waves that do not preserve memory, only movement. Standing on the edge of the sea today, it is difficult not to imagine those two galleys slipping beyond the horizon in 1291, carrying with them the hopes of discovery and the uncertainties of an uncharted world. What did they see beyond the Strait of Gibraltar? How far did they travel before the record ended? And most hauntingly of all, did their journey end quickly in disaster, or did it continue far beyond the reach of European chronicles, leaving only fragments of rumor behind? The ocean offers no answer, only distance and the enduring question of what becomes of those who sail far enough that history itself can no longer follow. If the fate of the Vivaldi brothers dissolves into the open ocean, where distance itself becomes a kind of erasure, then the next mystery draws us back to land, but to a different kind of vastness. Not the endless Atlantic horizon, but the dense forests, fortified castles, and shifting borders of medieval northern Europe. In the cold regions along the southeastern Baltic coast, where pine forests stretch across flatlands and rivers cut through dark soil, stone fortresses once rose as symbols of military order and religious authority. Their walls were built not only for defense, but for permanence, an attempt to impose structure on a frontier that was constantly changing. Among the most powerful of these institutions stood the Teutonic Order. Formed during the late 12th century, the Teutonic Knights began as a religious military order established during the Crusades. Over time, they shifted their focus toward the Baltic region, where they became a dominant force in what is now parts of modern Poland, Lithuania, and surrounding territories. Their presence reshaped entire landscapes, founding fortified cities, constructing castles, and establishing a network of control that extended across trade routes and rural settlements. With such power came immense resources. Land grants, tithes, military spoils, and trade revenues flowed into the order's possession. Chronicles describe storehouses filled with grain, fortified treasuries within castles, and accumulated wealth gathered through centuries of expansion and conflict. Some of this wealth was material: gold, silver, coins minted under the order's authority. Some of it was strategic: arms, supplies, and valuable trade goods that sustained their influence across the region. But as with many medieval institutions, the question is not only what was possessed, but what was lost. The Teutonic Order's fortunes began to shift in the 15th century. Military defeats, changing political alliances, and the gradual weakening of crusading authority in Europe reduced their power. The Battle of Grunwald in 1410 marked one of the most significant turning points, where the order suffered a major defeat against Allied forces from the Polish-Lithuanian coalition. After such conflicts, historical records become less clear about the full extent of their remaining wealth. Treasury inventories from different periods show inconsistencies. Some assets appear in one record and vanish in another. Castles that once served as administrative and financial centers were abandoned, repurposed, or destroyed over time. Wars, political restructuring, and the secularization of the order's territories further complicated the preservation of records. So, what happened to the wealth that once supported such a powerful organization? One explanation is rooted in gradual redistribution. As the order's influence declined, its assets would have been seized, transferred, or absorbed by emerging political powers. Coins would be melted and recast, religious objects redistributed to churches, agricultural wealth consumed by ongoing conflicts and administrative change. This is the most straightforward interpretation. Yet it does not fully explain the sense of absence that lingers in historical accounts. Some chronicles and later traditions suggest that portions of the order's wealth may have been hidden during periods of instability. Castles, often designed with hidden chambers and fortified basements, could have served as temporary storage sites during sieges or retreats. In times of war, it was not uncommon for valuable assets to be concealed rather than risk capture. The dense forests and marshlands of the Baltic region provide further space for speculation. Vast areas remained difficult to traverse or fully control during medieval times. If something was hidden in such terrain, buried, concealed, or deliberately abandoned, it might remain undiscovered even today. Over the centuries, local legends began to emerge in various parts of the former Teutonic territories. Some speak of buried hoards near ruined castles. Others describe sealed chambers beneath collapsed fortifications, protected by structural collapse or intentional sealing. In certain cases, treasure hunters and historians have reported anomalies, unexplained cavities beneath castle grounds, or architectural features that do not align neatly with known historical layouts. While none of these claims have produced definitive proof, they continue to fuel interest in what might still lie beneath the surface. Another line of speculation turns toward the symbolic nature of the order's wealth. Some historians argue that what is often described as treasure may have included not only physical riches, but also archives, manuscripts, and records of political or economic significance. If such documents were lost or deliberately destroyed, their absence could represent an intellectual as well as material loss. This raises a different kind of question. When we speak of missing treasure, are we always referring to gold and silver, or can knowledge itself become a form of lost wealth? The final years of the Teutonic Order's political dominance further complicate the picture. As secular rulers absorbed its remaining territories, administrative structures changed. Castles were converted, archives relocated, and older records sometimes discarded or forgotten. The transition from military order to territorial administration created gaps in continuity that historians still attempt to reconstruct. And yet, even in modern times, archaeological work across the Baltic region continues to uncover remnants of the order's presence. Foundations of castles emerge from forests. Coins are discovered buried in soil far from known trade centers. Fragments of weapons, seals, and ceremonial objects surface unexpectedly during excavations. Each discovery adds detail, but not closure. Because no single find has ever revealed a centralized, intact treasury belonging to the Teutonic Knights. Only fragments remain. Scattered across countries, museums, private collections, and archaeological sites, they form a dispersed pattern rather than a complete picture. So the question remains open. Did the wealth of the Teutonic Order simply dissolve over time through war, politics, and redistribution? Or was something deliberately concealed during moments of crisis, hidden in castles, forests, or forgotten chambers that have yet to be fully explored? Standing among the ruins of Baltic fortresses today, it is possible to trace the outlines of walls that once held immense power, stone corridors that echoed with footsteps of knights and administrators, courtyards where decisions shaped entire regions. Now those spaces are silent, and beneath that silence lies a final uncertainty. When an order built on centuries of wealth and authority fades from history, does its treasure disappear with it? Or does part of it remain, still buried somewhere beneath the forests and stones of a world that has long since moved on? If the hidden wealth of the Teutonic Knights fades into forests and forgotten stone, the next mystery takes us outward once again, away from fortified land, away from castles and borders, and toward a coastline where land and sea were never fully separated, only temporarily negotiated. Along the edge of the North Sea, where tides rise and fall with relentless rhythm, the landscape of northern Europe flattens into marshes, mudflats, and low-lying coastal plains. Today, it is a region shaped by dikes, drainage systems, and careful engineering. But in earlier centuries, before modern flood defenses, this was a place where the sea could reclaim land without warning. And within this fragile environment lies the legend of Rungholt. Often called the Atlantis of the North Sea, Rungholt is described in medieval and early modern tradition as a wealthy settlement that once existed in the region of North Frisia, near what is now the coast of Germany. According to legend, it was a prosperous harbor town engaged in trade across the North Sea, connected to broader commercial networks that linked northern Europe's coastal communities. But unlike many medieval towns that can be traced through surviving records or archaeological remains, Rungholt exists at the boundary between history and absence. The earliest references to its destruction appear in later chronicles and local traditions, often written centuries after the events they describe. These accounts tell of a catastrophic storm tide that struck the region in 1362, known in historical records as the Grote Mondrenke, or Great Drowning of Men. This storm is well documented. It reshaped coastlines, destroyed settlements, and claimed thousands of lives across the North Sea region. Villages were lost, farmland was submerged, entire stretches of coastline were permanently altered, and among the places said to have disappeared was Rungholt. According to legend, the town was not merely damaged, but completely swallowed by the sea in a single night. Churches, homes, and harbor structures were said to have vanished beneath rising waters, leaving no visible trace above the surface. For centuries afterward, sailors told stories of ruins beneath the waves, bells ringing faintly under the sea during storms, structures glimpsed through shifting tides, a drowned city lying just beyond reach, visible only in fragments when conditions allowed. But what can be confirmed historically? This is where the mystery becomes more complex. There is no definitive contemporary record that clearly describes Rungholt as a major urban center before the 1362 storm. Some historians suggest that the name may have referred to a smaller settlement or cluster of villages rather than a large city. Over time, oral tradition may have amplified its importance, transforming a modest community into a symbol of lost prosperity. At the same time, archaeological studies in the Wadden Sea region have confirmed that numerous medieval settlements did exist in areas now submerged or reclaimed by tidal changes. Foundations, wells, and agricultural structures have been discovered beneath mudflats, revealing how dynamic and vulnerable this coastline once was. So the question becomes not whether people lived and worked in this landscape. They did. But how much of it has been lost beyond clear identification? The North Sea itself plays an active role in this uncertainty. Unlike a static environment, it is constantly reshaping the land through erosion, sediment movement, and storm activity. Over centuries, coastlines have advanced and retreated repeatedly. What was once solid ground can become seabed, and what is buried today may be exposed tomorrow. In such a setting, distinguishing between specific historical sites becomes a challenge. Could Rungholt have been one of many settlements affected by the same catastrophic storm tide, later remembered as a single lost city? Some researchers suggest this is likely. The 1362 storm impacted a wide area, destroying multiple communities along the Frisian coast. In the aftermath, as survivors rebuilt and relocated, memories of different places may have merged into a single narrative of loss. Yet the enduring image of Rungholt remains more than a simple record of destruction. Medieval and later folklore often describes it as a place of great wealth and moral excess, a city that became so prosperous it drew divine punishment. These themes are common in European flood legends, where natural disasters are interpreted through moral or spiritual frameworks. This raises another question. How much of Rungholt is historical and how much is symbolic? Some interpretations view the legend as a cultural memory of repeated flooding events, encoded into storytelling traditions. Others suggest it reflects the human tendency to transform environmental catastrophe into narrative meaning, giving shape to events that were otherwise chaotic and incomprehensible. There are also more speculative ideas, often inspired by occasional underwater discoveries in the region. Sonar mapping and tidal surveys have revealed submerged structures in the Wadden Sea, including remnants of roads, building foundations, and landscape features that indicate past human settlement. However, none of these findings have been definitively linked to Rungholt itself. The sea continues to shift, covering and uncovering traces of the past with each tide. What is visible in one season may be gone in the next. This constant movement makes long-term archaeological certainty difficult and ensures that much of the historical landscape remains partially hidden. Standing on the modern dikes that protect northern Germany today, it is possible to look out across waters that once covered inhabited land. Beneath the surface lies a layered history, some documented, much of it inferred, and some still unknown. And so Rungholt remains suspended between erosion and memory, between storm record and legend. Was it truly a wealthy medieval city erased in a single catastrophic night? A cluster of smaller settlements later unified in folklore? Or a symbol created from the repeated experience of living alongside a sea that never stopped reclaiming land? The North Sea gives no answer. It only continues its movement, shaping and reshaping the boundary between land and water, as if reminding us that some histories are not lost all at once, but slowly absorbed, tide by tide, until only the question remains. If Rungholt fades beneath the North Sea's shifting tides, remembered more in legend than in surviving structures, then the next mystery turns us inland again, into mountains, valleys, and borderlands where history does not disappear beneath water, but beneath silence, exile, and uncertainty. In the rugged landscapes of Wales, where green hills rise and fall like waves of earth and ancient castles still cling to ridgelines, there are places where history feels close enough to touch. Stone fortresses stand in partial ruin, their walls shaped by centuries of conflict between local Welsh principalities and expanding English power. Narrow roads wind through valleys that once carried armies, messengers, and fugitives. It is here, in the early 15th century, that one of Britain's most enduring historical enigmas takes shape. The story centers on Owain Glyndŵr. A Welsh nobleman, military leader, and symbol of resistance, Glyndŵr became the figurehead of a major Welsh uprising against English rule beginning in 1400. His revolt was not a brief rebellion, it was a sustained conflict that reshaped political control across Wales for years. At its height, he was proclaimed Prince of Wales by his supporters, and for a time he held significant territory, political influence, and military strength. Chroniclers of the period describe a man deeply embedded in both the political and cultural identity of Wales, someone capable of uniting disparate factions under a shared cause of autonomy and resistance. But by the early 15th century, the tide of war began to shift. English forces gradually regained control of key territories. Towns were retaken, castles were reinforced. Glyndŵr's support base weakened under sustained military pressure and economic strain. By around 1412, historical records begin to thin dramatically, and then he disappears from the historical record altogether. No confirmed record of his death exists. No burial site has ever been identified with certainty. No contemporary chronicle clearly describes his final days. The man who once appeared frequently in political and military documentation simply fades from view. This absence is what transformed Owain Glyndŵr from historical figure into enduring mystery. Mainstream historical interpretations generally suggest that he likely died in hiding, possibly in the early 15th century, after years of evading capture. The conditions of the time support this possibility. As a known rebel leader, he would have faced severe consequences if captured, making concealment a logical outcome. Some accounts, written years later, claim that he lived out his final years in secrecy, possibly moving between estates of loyal supporters or relatives who sheltered him away from public view. These narratives suggest a quiet end to a once public life, far from battlefields and political declarations. Yet even these accounts are not definitive. They were recorded after his disappearance, not during his lifetime, and they vary in detail. This lack of certainty has allowed alternative interpretations to persist. One line of speculation suggests that Glyndŵr may have escaped beyond Wales entirely, possibly seeking refuge in remote rural regions or even outside Britain. Given the political networks of the time and the presence of sympathetic supporters in various regions, such movement would not have been impossible. However, no verifiable records confirm this. Other interpretations focus less on physical disappearance and more on deliberate historical erasure. In periods of political consolidation, the documentation of rebel leaders was often suppressed, destroyed, or rewritten by opposing authorities. Could the scarcity of records reflect not only secrecy in life, but also intentional omission after death? This question becomes especially relevant when considering how historical narratives are formed. Unlike monarchs whose deaths were formally recorded and commemorated, figures associated with rebellion often occupy a more ambiguous archival space. Their endings are sometimes less documented, not because they were unknown, but because they were politically inconvenient. Yet even with these considerations, Owain Glyndŵr's disappearance remains unusually complete. No confirmed grave has been found. No definitive artifact linked to his final years has been recovered, and no single historical source provides closure. Over time, his absence became part of his legacy. In Welsh cultural memory, Glyndŵr is not only a historical figure, but also a symbol of enduring national identity and resistance. Poems, songs, and oral traditions preserved his memory long after written records grew silent. In some interpretations, this cultural memory itself became a form of continuation, allowing his presence to persist in narrative even when physical traces were gone. Meanwhile, historians and archaeologists have continued to explore possible sites associated with his final years. Rural estates, hidden valleys, and remote farmsteads have all been considered as potential locations where he may have lived in secrecy. Yet none have produced conclusive evidence. The landscape of Wales itself adds another layer to the mystery. Its geography, filled with secluded valleys, dense forests, and isolated highlands, offers countless places where an individual could vanish from public view, especially in an era without centralized surveillance or rapid communication. It is not difficult to imagine how someone could disappear into such terrain. And yet the absence of confirmation remains striking. Because even in cases of hidden deaths, history usually leaves fragments, burial references, administrative records, or local traditions that can be traced with some degree of certainty. In Glyndŵr's case, these fragments are fragmented themselves, never forming a complete picture. So the question lingers. Did Owain Glyndŵr die quietly in obscurity, his passing unrecorded because it occurred far from the centers of power that once sought him? Or did he live longer than expected, his final years spent in secrecy, deliberately hidden from a world that would have turned his survival into political consequence? And perhaps more intriguingly, why has his disappearance endured so strongly in historical memory? Standing among the ruins of Welsh castles today, looking across valleys where his campaign once unfolded, it is possible to feel the weight of both history and absence. Stone walls remain. Place names persist. Cultural memory continues to echo. But the man himself does not. Only the uncertainty remains, carried forward across 6 centuries. If Owain Glyndŵr's disappearance fades into the silence of mountains and hidden valleys, then the next mystery draws us into a very different world, one of royal courts, polished stone floors, and candlelit chambers where power was not lost in exile, but in the quiet collapse of a single human body. In the Loire Valley of France, where rivers wind past limestone chateaux and morning mist settles over vineyards and gardens, the royal court of the 15th century once moved with calculated elegance. Castles were not merely fortresses here, they were centers of influence, where politics, intimacy, and ambition intertwined behind carved wooden doors and richly decorated chambers. Among the figures who moved through this world, few were as influential or as controversial as Agnès Sorel. Born around 1422, Agnès Sorel became a prominent figure at the court of King Charles VII of France. She is often recognized as one of the first officially acknowledged royal mistresses in French history. Contemporary accounts describe her not only as a companion to the king, but also as a woman of considerable influence in court life, reportedly involved in matters of fashion, patronage, and political favor. Portraits and descriptions from the period emphasize her presence, elegant, confident, and deeply embedded within the orbit of royal power. In a court shaped by war and political instability during the latter stages of the 100 Years' War, influence at the center of power carried significant weight. But in 1450, her life came to an abrupt and unexpected end. She died at the age of just 28. The official cause recorded at the time was severe illness, often described in general terms as a digestive or intestinal condition. Medieval medical understanding was limited, and many deaths were attributed to natural causes without precise diagnosis. From this perspective, her passing may appear unremarkable within the broader context of the era. Yet from the moment of her death, uncertainty began to grow. The circumstances surrounding her final days were unusual enough to raise questions among contemporaries. Some accounts suggest she fell ill suddenly while traveling with the royal court. Others describe a rapid decline in health that seemed difficult to explain, even by the medical standards of the time. And then there are the rumors. Within court circles, whispers began to circulate that her death may not have been entirely natural. Agnès Sorel was not a passive figure in royal life. She was politically visible, influential, and at times controversial. Influence in such proximity to power often created tension among nobles, advisors, and members of the royal household. While no definitive historical record confirms foul play, the suspicions themselves became part of the narrative surrounding her death. Centuries later, this uncertainty took a more tangible form. When her remains were examined in modern times, analyses revealed unusually high levels of mercury. This finding introduced a new layer of complexity to the historical record. Mercury was known in medieval medicine and was sometimes used in treatments for various conditions, including parasitic infections and other ailments, despite its toxicity. This has led to multiple interpretations. One mainstream explanation suggests that Agnès Sorel may have been treated with mercury-based compounds as part of contemporary medical practice, unintentionally leading to poisoning over time. In this view, her death would be a tragic consequence of the limitations of medieval medicine rather than intentional harm. However, this explanation does not entirely settle the question. The levels detected have prompted further debate among researchers. Could they be explained solely by medical treatment? Or do they suggest exposure beyond what would typically be expected in standard therapeutic use of the time? This uncertainty has allowed alternative theories to persist. Some historians and writers have considered the possibility of deliberate poisoning, given the political environment of the French court. Agnès Sorel's influence over the king may have created rivalries or tensions among those who sought greater access to royal authority. In such an environment, court intrigue was not uncommon, and accusations, whether justified or not, often followed sudden or unexplained deaths. Yet, as with many historical mysteries, direct evidence remains absent. No contemporary trial, confession, or official accusation survives to confirm intentional harm. What remains instead is ambiguity. A sudden death, limited medical understanding, and later scientific findings that complicate rather than clarify the story. Her burial also reflects her unusual position in life and death. Agnès Sorel was interred with honors that reflected her status at court, a recognition of her proximity to royal power, even if her official role remained outside traditional noble structures. Her tomb became a physical reminder of her presence in a court defined by shifting alliances and political uncertainty. Over time, her image has taken on symbolic dimensions. In historical memory, she is sometimes portrayed as a figure who challenged traditional boundaries of influence within the royal court, shaping perceptions of power, femininity, and proximity to authority in 15th century France. But beneath these interpretations, the central question remains unresolved. Did Agnès Sorel die from natural causes, complicated by the limits of medieval medicine? Was her death accelerated by treatments intended to heal rather than harm? Or does the evidence hint at a more deliberate act concealed within the complexities of court life? Modern analysis provides data, but not definitive closure. And so the mystery persists, not in the grand scale of vanished cities or lost expeditions, but in something more intimate, the final, uncertain moments of a single life at the heart of power. Walking through the quiet halls of the Loire Valley today, where sunlight reflects off stone walls that once echoed with courtly conversation, it is difficult not to imagine the presence she once held in those spaces. And yet, even with surviving records, portraits, and scientific findings, one question remains suspended in time. When Agnès Sorel died at the height of her influence, was it simply the end of a fragile life in a fragile age, or is there still something hidden within? If the strange death of Agnès Sorel reminds us how fragile truth can be within the walls of power, then the next mystery moves from the private chambers of royalty to the public stage of war, faith, and identity, where history itself becomes something that can be imitated, disputed, and rewritten. In the early 15th century, across the fractured landscape of France, villages, fortresses, and battle-scarred fields formed the backdrop of one of the most turbulent periods in European history. The 100 Years' War was not a single continuous conflict, but a shifting series of battles, alliances, and occupations that left entire regions uncertain of authority and allegiance. It is within this world that Joan of Arc emerged. A young woman from Domremy, she rose from relative obscurity to become one of the most extraordinary figures of medieval Europe. Claiming divine guidance, she led French forces during a critical phase of the war, helping to turn the tide in favor of Charles VII. Her presence at key military events, most notably the lifting of the siege of Orléans, became part of national memory. But her story, as preserved in historical record, does not end with triumph. She was captured, tried, and executed in 1431. Her death was intended to close a chapter. Yet within a few years, something unusual began to appear in the historical record. Reports emerged of a woman claiming to be Joan of Arc. Not the Joan of court records, nor the Joan of official testimony, but another figure altogether, asserting survival beyond the execution at Rouen. This individual is often referred to in historical discussions as the false Joan of Arc, though the label itself already introduces uncertainty. False according to whom, and based on which version of events. The most well-known case centers on a woman who appeared in France in the 1430s, several years after Joan's death. Contemporary accounts describe her as a figure who claimed to be the surviving Joan, asserting that she had escaped execution and continued her life in secrecy. She reportedly gathered attention from segments of the population, particularly in regions still affected by political instability and lingering conflict. Some sources suggest she was received by individuals who either believed her claim or were willing to entertain it under uncertain conditions. Her identity, however, was never confirmed in a way that satisfied official authorities. Eventually, she was exposed, discredited, and integrated into historical records under a different name, Catherine of Vaucouleurs in some accounts, though even this identification is debated among historians. What makes the case particularly intriguing is not only the claim itself, but the environment in which it arose. 15th century France was a landscape where communication was limited, records were inconsistent, and news traveled slowly. In such conditions, the boundary between fact, rumor, and political manipulation could become difficult to maintain. The execution of Joan of Arc was widely known, but the emotional and symbolic weight of her legacy left space for stories to evolve. So the question becomes, who was this woman who claimed to be Joan? Mainstream historical interpretation generally regards her as an imposter or a mistaken identity, someone either seeking social advantage, suffering from delusion, or caught within the chaotic aftermath of a deeply symbolic execution. In this view, the case is not a resurrection of Joan of Arc, but a reflection of how powerful figures can generate echoes in the historical imagination. Yet the story does not end so neatly. Some accounts suggest that the woman displayed knowledge of Joan's life that impressed or confused those who encountered her. Others describe her as gaining temporary support among certain groups before being challenged by authorities or individuals closely connected to Joan's original life. These inconsistencies have fueled centuries of speculation. Was she an opportunist leveraging a famous name in a time of instability? Or did she genuinely believe herself to be Joan of Arc, shaped by trauma, belief, or psychological identification with a figure who had already become legendary within her lifetime? There is also the broader question of identity itself in the medieval world. In an era without modern documentation systems, identity was often established through recognition, testimony, and reputation rather than fixed records. Physical resemblance, memory, and local acknowledgement could carry significant weight. In such a context, disputes over identity were not always straightforward. Some modern interpretations explore the possibility that the false Joan phenomenon reflects the rapid mythologizing of Joan of Arc even during her own century. As her story spread, it may have become possible for multiple individuals to be associated with her identity in rumor or belief, especially in regions far from the centers where her trial and execution were recorded. More speculative theories venture further, suggesting deliberate impersonation for political or symbolic purposes. If factions within France or surrounding regions wished to manipulate public sentiment, the reappearance of a figure claiming to be Joan could have served strategic aims, either to inspire hope, create confusion, or challenge established narratives. However, no definitive evidence confirms coordinated deception at that level. What remains instead is a fragmented set of references, court records, local testimonies, and later historical interpretations that attempt to piece together what actually occurred. Over time, the false Joan of Arc becomes less a single individual and more a recurring question within the historical record. What does it mean when identity itself becomes contested? When belief, memory, and documentation no longer align cleanly, where does truth reside? The ruins of medieval France today offer no answers to these questions. Castles where trials once took place still stand in partial form. Towns that once witnessed declarations of identity have been rebuilt, renamed, and reimagined across centuries. And yet, the story persists. Because whether she was an imposter, a confused survivor of historical trauma, or a figure shaped by the extraordinary resonance of Joan's legacy, the false Joan of Arc forces us to confront a deeper uncertainty. How many versions of a single life can exist within the boundaries of historical memory before certainty itself begins to dissolve? And as long as that question remains unresolved, one final reflection lingers in the silence of the archives. When someone claimed to be Joan of Arc after her death, was it simply a case of mistaken identity, or a glimpse into how easily even the most definitive endings in history can begin to blur? If the story of the false Joan of Arc shows how identity itself can fracture under the weight of belief and legend, then the next mystery moves from contested human memory into something even more enduring. Objects believed to carry the physical trace of a single defining moment in religious history. Across the hills of Jerusalem, where stone streets wind through layers of ancient civilization, there are places that feel less like geography and more like accumulated time. Churches built over earlier churches, foundations resting on foundations, shrines marking events that have been retold, rebuilt, and reinterpreted for nearly 2 millennia. It is here, within the heart of Christian tradition, that the story of the true cross begins. According to early accounts, the true cross refers to the wooden cross upon which Jesus of Nazareth was crucified in the 1st century BC. Within Christian tradition, its discovery is attributed to Helena, mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine, during a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the 4th century AD. The relic quickly became one of the most significant symbols in medieval Christianity. Fragments of the cross were distributed across churches and monasteries throughout Europe and the Byzantine world. Over time, these relics became objects of devotion, pilgrimage, and immense symbolic importance. They were believed not only to represent a historical event, but to carry a direct physical connection to it. Yet, from the earliest centuries of their circulation, questions arose. How many fragments could truly come from a single wooden structure? And how could so many different locations claim possession of pieces of the same object? By the medieval period, relics identified as pieces of the true cross were present in numerous churches across Europe, from major cathedrals to remote monasteries. Some were small splinters encased in ornate reliquaries. Others were larger fragments displayed with great ceremonial significance. This widespread distribution created one of the most enduring tensions in religious history: the relationship between faith, authenticity, and material evidence. From a historical perspective, the early spread of relics can be partially understood through the practices of the time. Relics were often divided, gifted, or symbolically associated with sacred objects to extend their spiritual significance. Pilgrimages to Jerusalem increased demand for tangible connections to holy sites, and ecclesiastical authorities played a central role in certifying and distributing such items. However, not all claims can be traced with equal clarity. Some relics appear in historical records with clear provenance, while others emerge suddenly in later centuries without documented origins. Over time, this has created a complex and sometimes contradictory map of competing claims. So what happened to the original material identified as the true cross? Mainstream historical interpretation suggests that the original wooden structure, if it existed in the form described by tradition, would have been lost, destroyed, or dispersed long before modern record-keeping. The Roman practice of execution by crucifixion involved reuse and disposal of materials, making long-term preservation unlikely under ordinary circumstances. From this perspective, relics associated with the cross are understood primarily as objects of devotion rather than verifiable physical remnants of a single artifact. Yet the mystery persists not because of absence alone, but because of proliferation. How did so many fragments come to exist across such a wide geographical area? Some explanations point to medieval practices of replication and symbolic relic creation, where contact with an existing relic was believed to transfer sanctity, allowing new objects to become spiritually connected to the original. In this framework, physical continuity was less important than devotional continuity. Others suggest that the fragmentation of relics reflects the political and religious dynamics of medieval Europe, where possession of sacred objects conferred prestige, legitimacy, and influence. Churches and rulers alike benefited from association with revered artifacts, which may have encouraged the multiplication and circulation of claimed fragments. Still, there are aspects that remain difficult to fully reconcile. Historical inventories from different regions occasionally describe relics in ways that suggest independent origins rather than a single shared source. In some cases, fragments were treated with such reverence that their authenticity was never publicly questioned, even when overlapping claims existed elsewhere. This has led some scholars to propose a more nuanced possibility, that what is preserved today may not represent a single physical object divided over time, but rather a collection of materials brought together through centuries of devotion, tradition, and symbolic association. In more speculative interpretations, the relics are viewed not as literal remnants of a single cross, but as focal points of a broader spiritual narrative, objects whose significance lies in belief systems rather than physical continuity. In this view, the true cross becomes less an archaeological question and more a reflection of how meaning is constructed and preserved across generations. Modern scientific analysis of some claimed relics has provided limited but intriguing data. Certain wooden fragments have been identified as originating from species consistent with the Middle East, though such findings cannot definitively link them to a specific historical event or object. Additionally, the age and treatment of many relics vary widely, reflecting their complex transmission history. And so the question remains open. In Jerusalem, the landscape continues to preserve its layered past. Beneath modern structures lie ancient stones. Within churches, relics are still venerated. Pilgrims continue to visit sites associated with events that shaped entire religious traditions. But the physical truth behind those traditions remains elusive. Are the relics of the true cross genuine fragments of a single historical object preserved across centuries? Are they symbolic representations that gained physical form through devotion and history? Or do they exist somewhere in between, part material, part meaning, shaped as much by belief as by origin? The archives offer fragments of answers, but not resolution. And as the story passes through time, one final question remains suspended in the quiet spaces between history and faith. When so many pieces claim to belong to one sacred object, where does the truth of the original truly reside? If the relics of the true cross dissolve the boundary between material history and belief, then the next mystery shifts us into something far more visceral, an event not preserved in fragments of wood or stone, but in mass graves, abandoned villages, and a silence that once swept across continents. In the mid-14th century, Europe was a world in motion. Trade routes stretched from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, from North Africa to the interior of Asia. Merchant ships carried silk, grain, spices, and wool across seas that connected distant civilizations. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Constantinople formed nodes in a vast, interconnected system of exchange. And yet, Within this web of movement, something began to spread that would alter the course of human history: the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, a devastating pandemic swept across Europe, killing an estimated third to half of the population in some regions. Entire towns were emptied, agricultural systems collapsed, trade networks fractured. The scale of the mortality was unlike anything recorded in European history at the time. But despite centuries of research, one fundamental question still carries a quiet uncertainty beneath the surface. Where exactly did it begin? The most widely accepted historical account traces the outbreak to the Crimean port city of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, on the Black Sea. In 1347, during a siege involving Mongol forces and Genoese traders, chroniclers describe infected bodies being catapulted over city walls. From there, fleeing merchants are believed to have carried the disease along maritime trade routes to Sicily, Italy, and beyond. This narrative is supported by contemporaneous accounts and aligns with known patterns of medieval trade and movement. From Kaffa, ships could reach major Mediterranean ports within weeks, allowing the infection to spread rapidly across densely connected coastal regions. Yet even this widely accepted origin point is not without complexity. Because the Black Sea was not an isolated frontier, it was part of a much larger network stretching deep into Eurasia. Caravans moved goods across Central Asia. Trade routes connected China, India, Persia, and the Middle East long before the plague reached European shores. This raises an important distinction in historical analysis. The point of European emergence is not necessarily the same as the point of origin. So, where did the pathogen truly begin its journey? Some historical interpretations extend the origin further east, toward Central Asia. Contemporary observers and later historians have noted that outbreaks resembling plague-like symptoms were reported in regions along the Silk Road prior to 1347. These accounts describe sudden, high-mortality events in cities and settlements across the steppe regions and beyond. However, the documentary record from these areas is fragmentary. Unlike Europe, where chroniclers recorded the plague in detail, many regions along the wider trade network left fewer surviving written sources from the period. This makes it difficult to reconstruct a precise epidemiological timeline. Modern scientific research has added another layer to the investigation. Genetic studies of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague, suggest that its evolutionary history predates the 14th century by thousands of years. Ancient DNA analysis indicates that ancestral strains existed across parts of Asia long before the Black Death emerged in Europe. This supports the idea that the bacterium circulated in multiple reservoirs across Eurasia, evolving and spreading under conditions that are still not fully understood. But even genetic evidence does not provide a single, definitive starting point. Instead, it points to a more complex reality: a long-standing ecological presence that may have periodically erupted under specific environmental and social conditions. This raises another question. Was there ever a single origin at all? Some historians and epidemiologists now suggest that the Black Death may not have begun in one precise location, but rather emerged from a convergence of overlapping outbreaks across interconnected regions. Climatic shifts, population movements, trade intensification, and ecological changes may have created conditions that allowed multiple local reservoirs of infection to ignite simultaneously or in rapid sequence. In this view, the idea of a singular origin point becomes less certain, replaced by a network of contributing factors spread across geography and time. Still, the historical imagination continues to gravitate toward origin stories. Kaffa remains central because it represents the first clearly documented point of transmission into Europe. From there, the timeline becomes more visible, more traceable, and more narratively coherent. But what lies before Kaffa is still partially obscured. Fragmented reports, indirect references, and modern reconstructions attempting to bridge gaps left by time. There are also more speculative interpretations, often rooted in attempts to reconcile historical gaps with broader theories of disease emergence. Some propose that environmental disruptions, such as climate fluctuations during the Little Ice Age, may have altered rodent populations and disease vectors across Eurasia, triggering wider outbreaks. Others explore the possibility that long-distance ecological interactions, poorly documented in medieval sources, played a larger role than previously understood. While these ideas remain under study and debate, they reflect an ongoing effort to understand how such a catastrophic event could emerge within a connected world that, even in the 14th century, was far more global than it might initially appear. What remains consistent across all interpretations is the scale of what followed. From port cities to rural villages, from monasteries to military encampments, the Black Death reshaped societies in ways that extended far beyond mortality. It altered economic structures, religious perceptions, labor systems, and even artistic expression. Its origins, however, remain wrapped in layers of movement, transmission, and incomplete record-keeping. Today, historians continue to refine models of its spread using archaeology, genetics, and comparative analysis of medieval texts. Yet no single source has definitively pinpointed a solitary first case or a precise moment of emergence that can be isolated from the wider context of Eurasian disease ecology. And so the mystery persists, not as a lack of evidence, but as an excess of interconnected pathways. Somewhere along the trade routes that stitched together continents, something changed, quietly at first, then catastrophically. But whether that change began in a single city, a distant steppe, or across multiple regions at once remains an open question. And as we look back across the centuries at a world transformed almost beyond recognition, one question continues to linger in the historical record. When the Black Death first entered human history, did it truly have a single point of origin, or was it born from a far more complex and still partially hidden network of beginnings? If the Black Death reminds us how something invisible can reshape entire civilizations, then the next mystery brings us back to something intensely visible, an object designed not only to symbolize power, but to embody it. In the heart of medieval Constantinople, where domes of stone and mosaic once caught the shifting light of the Bosporus, the Imperial Palace complex stood as the center of an empire that saw itself as the continuation of Rome. Within its walls, ceremonies unfolded with precise ritual, reinforcing the idea that authority was not merely political, but divinely sanctioned. Among the many treasures housed in this imperial world, few carried more symbolic weight than the crown of the Byzantine emperors. Unlike later European coronation crowns, which were often preserved as continuous dynastic objects, the Byzantine imperial regalia existed within a world of constant adaptation. Emperors were crowned in elaborate ceremonies, often within the Hagia Sophia, surrounded by clergy, court officials, and relics believed to connect earthly rule with divine order. Descriptions of imperial regalia appear in court records, inventories, and ceremonial texts. Gold, pearls, enamel, and precious stones were used extensively in Byzantine craftsmanship, and crowns were often richly adorned, reflecting both wealth and theological symbolism. Yet when historians attempt to trace the physical continuity of a singular crown of Constantinople, the record becomes uncertain. Because unlike some European crowns that survived dynastic transitions, wars, and careful preservation, the imperial regalia of Constantinople did not pass intact into the modern era. The turning point came in 1204. During the Fourth Crusade, an event that began as a military campaign intended for the Holy Land was diverted toward Constantinople. The city, one of the most sophisticated and wealthy urban centers of the medieval world, was violently sacked. Contemporary chroniclers describe scenes of destruction within churches, palaces, and treasuries that had accumulated centuries of imperial wealth. Religious relics, manuscripts, artworks, and ceremonial objects were dispersed across Europe. Venice, in particular, became a major recipient of Byzantine artifacts, many of which were integrated into its own religious and political identity. It is within this historical rupture that the story of the imperial crown enters uncertain territory. Byzantine inventories prior to 1204 describe a range of imperial regalia, but references to a single, continuous crown that can be clearly traced across centuries are not straightforward. Instead, multiple ceremonial crowns may have existed at different times, used in different contexts, or modified for successive rulers. After the sack of Constantinople, however, the continuity of these objects is effectively broken. Some accounts suggest that imperial treasures were divided among crusader leaders and transported westward. Others indicate that many objects were melted down, repurposed, or lost amid the chaos of looting and destruction. Venice, Paris, and other European centers became repositories for Byzantine artifacts, but identifying specific imperial items among them remains extremely difficult. So what happened to the crown itself? One mainstream interpretation suggests that it did not survive as a singular object. Instead, elements of imperial regalia, gold work, jewels, ceremonial components, were likely separated and absorbed into other artifacts across Europe. In this view, the crown, as a distinct physical object, may have ceased to exist as early as the 13th century, even if its materials endured in altered forms. Yet the story does not end with material dispersal alone. Because Byzantine imperial ideology placed immense importance on continuity, the emperor was not merely a ruler, but a living symbol of divine order on earth. Objects used in coronation ceremonies were therefore not just decorative. They were integral to a system in which political legitimacy and sacred authority were inseparable. This raises a deeper question. When such an object disappears, does its meaning disperse with it, or does it persist in symbolic form? Some later European traditions suggest that relics or regalia from Constantinople were incorporated into coronation practices in the West. The transfer of imperial symbols, whether literal or conceptual, helped shape emerging notions of monarchy in medieval Europe. Even if the original crown did not survive intact, its influence may have continued through adapted forms of ceremonial regalia. In Venice, for example, the Doge's rituals incorporated elements of Byzantine ceremonial style, reflecting both admiration and appropriation of imperial tradition. In other regions, crowns and regalia evolved in ways that echoed Byzantine aesthetics, though not necessarily through direct material inheritance. Meanwhile, in Constantinople itself, the story took another dramatic turn. In 1453, the city fell to the Ottoman Empire after a prolonged siege. Hagia Sophia was transformed, imperial structures were repurposed, and the remaining symbols of Byzantine rule were absorbed into a new political and cultural framework. Any surviving regalia that had not already been removed or lost would likely have been dispersed again during this transition. And yet, despite centuries of upheaval, occasional references to lost imperial treasures continued to surface. Some inventories compiled after the Fourth Crusade list items whose descriptions resemble coronation regalia, but without enough detail to confirm identity. Later travelers and chroniclers occasionally mentioned seeing ornate crowns or jewels of uncertain origin in European treasuries, though these accounts are often difficult to verify and may reflect misidentification or symbolic interpretation. Archaeological evidence, meanwhile, provides fragments rather than continuity. Enamel work, gold ornaments, and ceremonial objects from the Byzantine world survive in museums and collections, but none can be definitively identified as the singular imperial crown described in later imagination. This absence has led to multiple interpretive frameworks. From a historical perspective, the most grounded explanation is fragmentation. The crown, if it existed as a distinct object, was likely dismantled, redistributed, or lost during the sack of 1204 and subsequent centuries of political upheaval. The materials that once composed it may still exist, but not in unified form. From a symbolic perspective, however, some scholars suggest that the crown of Constantinople may represent a broader category of imperial regalia rather than a single artifact. In this view, its disappearance is not the loss of one object, but the dissolution of an entire ceremonial system into dispersed cultural memory. And in more speculative interpretations, the possibility remains that certain artifacts housed in European collections today may still contain elements of Byzantine imperial regalia that have not yet been fully identified or understood within their original context. What makes the mystery endure is not only what is missing, but what cannot be fully reconstructed. We know Constantinople possessed extraordinary craftsmanship, immense wealth, and highly structured ceremonial traditions. We know objects of immense symbolic importance existed within its imperial system, and we know that after 1204, those systems were irreversibly disrupted. But between those points lies a gap that no single surviving record can fully bridge. Walking through modern Istanbul today, over the layered remains of Constantinople, it is possible to stand near sites where emperors once processed in elaborate ceremony, where crowns may once have been lifted above heads meant to represent divine authority on earth. The stones remain. The river still flows. The city endures under a different name. But the crown itself, whether singular or symbolic, no longer sits in any known treasury, no longer appears in any confirmed inventory, and no longer completes the ritual cycle it once defined. And so the question lingers, suspended between history and loss. When the empire fell and its treasures were scattered across continents, did the crown of Constantinople truly vanish into obscurity? Or does it still exist today, fragmented and unrecognized, hidden in plain sight among the surviving relics of a world that no longer exists? If the crown of Constantinople dissolves into fragments of empire and memory, then the next mystery pulls us back to the cold waters of the medieval Channel, where political fate was not decided in palaces alone, but on a single night at sea, beneath a sky that offered no warning of what was to come. In the early 12th century, the waters between Normandy and England were a vital corridor of power. Ships crossed regularly, carrying nobles, officials, merchants, and messengers between two closely linked realms. The sea was not yet a boundary in the modern sense. It was a shared space of movement, influence, and political continuity. Among these crossings, one voyage would become infamous not for its arrival, but for its absence. The White Ship. On a November evening in 1120, a vessel of exceptional reputation prepared to depart from Barfleur in Normandy. Contemporary accounts describe it as one of the finest ships of its time, captained by Thomas Fitzstephen, whose father had once helmed the vessel that carried William the Conqueror to England nearly half a century earlier. On board were members of the Anglo-Norman elite, including nobles, officials, and royal companions. Most significantly, the heir to the English throne, William Adelin, also boarded the ship that night. The White Ship was not merely a transport vessel. In symbolic terms, it represented the continuity of a dynasty. But what happened next would fracture that continuity completely. According to the chroniclers, the departure was delayed due to celebrations on shore. Wine was consumed, spirits were high. Some accounts suggest the passengers insisted on racing another vessel out of the harbor, pushing for speed and prestige despite the late hour and darkness. When the White Ship finally set out, it struck submerged rocks shortly after leaving port. The vessel sank rapidly. Of all those aboard, only a handful survived. And it is here that the historical record becomes strangely uneven, not in describing the disaster itself, but in what follows afterward. Because while medieval chronicles provide lists of those who died, the identities of the survivors are not consistently preserved across sources. Different accounts offer slightly different names, numbers, and outcomes. This inconsistency has created a subtle but enduring space for uncertainty. The most commonly cited survivor is a butcher from Rouen, described in some accounts as clinging to wreckage and escaping by chance. Other versions mention additional individuals who may have survived, but whose identities were either not recorded consistently or were lost in later transcription. Beyond these brief mentions, the survivors fade quickly from the narrative. Unlike the passengers who perished, whose deaths are tied directly to the political consequences of the disaster, the survivors occupy a more ambiguous historical space. They are present, but not central, recorded, but not followed. And yet the sinking of the White Ship triggered one of the most significant political crises in medieval England. The death of William Adelin left King Henry I without a legitimate male heir, leading to a prolonged period of civil conflict known as the Anarchy. This dramatic consequence is well documented. What is less clearly preserved is the human aftermath for those who lived through the wreck itself. What became of them? Mainstream historical interpretation suggests that the survivors returned to ordinary life. In a world where record-keeping was inconsistent and social mobility was limited, it is likely that most would have resumed their previous roles or integrated quietly into other communities. Their survival, while remarkable, would not necessarily have guaranteed historical attention. Yet the lack of detailed records has allowed other interpretations to emerge. Some historians and literary scholars have noted that medieval chronicles often focus intensely on elite figures, while offering only brief acknowledgement of lower-status individuals. This creates a structural imbalance in the historical record, where survival itself does not guarantee visibility. The butcher from Rouen, for example, appears in some accounts but is absent from others, suggesting either loss of documentation or selective preservation. This raises an important question. How many survivors existed in reality, and how many have simply been erased by the limits of record-keeping? The ambiguity deepens when considering the nature of medieval maritime disasters. Ships sinking at night in open water offered few opportunities for accurate witness accounts. Survivors may have drifted, been rescued by passing vessels, or reached shore in undocumented ways. In such conditions, even the basic number of survivors could vary depending on the source of information. There are also more speculative interpretations that explore the possibility of political silence shaping the narrative. Given the immense consequences of the White Ship disaster, some have suggested that chroniclers may have focused on the dead because they were politically significant, while the survivors, especially if of lower status, were deemed less relevant to the broader historical story being constructed. In this view, the mystery is not necessarily about hidden individuals, but about the selective nature of historical memory itself. What gets recorded, and what does not. There are even interpretive suggestions that the survival of certain individuals may have been deliberately downplayed or ignored in later retellings, particularly if their accounts did not align with emerging political narratives surrounding succession and legitimacy. However, there is no direct evidence of intentional suppression, only the absence of consistent detail. Archaeological evidence offers little clarification. The exact wreck site of the White Ship has never been conclusively identified. The shifting sands and currents of the English Channel make precise underwater preservation difficult, and medieval ship construction materials often degrade beyond recognition over time. As a result, physical traces of the event remain elusive. Instead, what survives is narrative structure. The sinking itself is clearly remembered. The rocks, the darkness, the sudden collapse into water, and the loss of an entire royal succession in a single night. But the survivors exist only at the margins of that memory, briefly acknowledged before disappearing again into historical silence. And so the focus shifts away from the catastrophe toward its quieter aftermath. Did any of those who survived go on to tell their story in detail, only for those accounts to be lost over time? Were there more survivors than the chronicles suggest, their names simply never recorded? Or did survival itself become so unremarkable in the aftermath of political crisis that it was not deemed worthy of preservation? The sea offers no answers to these questions. Standing on the modern coast near Barfleur, where ferries and fishing vessels now pass through waters once crossed by medieval ships, it is difficult to imagine the suddenness with which everything changed in 1120. One moment, a vessel carrying the future of a kingdom. The next, silence beneath the waves. And in that silence lies the enduring uncertainty. Because while history clearly records the catastrophe of the White Ship, it offers only fragments of those who escaped it. So the question remains, drifting across 9 centuries like debris on dark water. When the White Ship went down and reshaped an entire monarchy, who among its passengers truly survived, and how many of their stories were lost not in the sea, but in the gaps between what history chose to remember? If the White Ship fades beneath the waters of the Channel, carrying with it a dynasty reshaped by a single night, then the next mystery shifts us away from open sea and political catastrophe into something quieter, more contained, yet no less enigmatic. In the dim light of a medieval scriptorium, where candle flames flicker against stone walls and ink stains accumulate on wooden desks, manuscripts were not merely written, they were constructed. Every page was a deliberate act of labor, involving scribes, illustrators, and binders working in carefully ordered silence. Within this world of controlled creation, books were not mass-produced objects. They were singular artifacts, shaped by intention, patronage, and purpose. Among these surviving manuscripts is a codex that continues to resist simple explanation. The Zouch Codex. Preserved today in fragmentary historical references and limited scholarly attention compared to more famous medieval texts, the Zouch Codex is associated with a tradition of legal and ecclesiastical writing in medieval England. It is linked to the Zouch family, a prominent noble lineage with influence in administrative, judicial, and religious affairs during the 13th and 14th centuries. At first glance, the Codex appears to belong to a familiar category, a compilation of legal texts, ecclesiastical records, and administrative notes typical of medieval governance. Such manuscripts were essential tools for maintaining order, recording decisions, and asserting authority across dispersed territories. But as scholars examine the surviving descriptions and references to the Codex, questions begin to surface about its deeper purpose. Because the Zouch Codex does not behave like a standard administrative manuscript. Its structure, as reconstructed from partial references, suggests layers of content that do not always align with purely legal function. Legal formulas appear alongside theological commentary. Administrative records are interwoven with passages that seem unusually interpretive or symbolic in tone. In some descriptions, marginal annotations hint at discussions that go beyond the immediate scope of governance. This raises an early question. Was the Codex simply a legal document, or something more complex embedded within a legal framework? Mainstream historical interpretation generally views the Zouch Codex as a practical compilation. In this reading, any irregularities in structure can be explained by the nature of medieval manuscript production itself. Scribes often copied from multiple sources. Documents were updated over time. Marginal notes accumulated as working references rather than as part of a unified design. From this perspective, the Codex is not mysterious. It is simply layered, like many medieval manuscripts shaped by decades of use. Yet this explanation does not fully settle the curiosity surrounding it. Because certain references suggest that the Codex may have served functions beyond administration. Some scholars have noted that manuscripts associated with noble families occasionally contained encoded or semi-hidden material, genealogical assertions, political commentary, or ideological framing presented in subtle form. In a period where power was deeply tied to lineage, law, and ecclesiastical approval, written documents could serve multiple purposes simultaneously: legal record, political instrument, and symbolic assertion of legitimacy. Could the Zouche Codex have operated within this overlapping space? One line of interpretation suggests that it may have functioned as a private reference work for a network of administrators, combining official legal material with internal commentary not intended for wide circulation. In this sense, the Codex would not be a public legal text, but a controlled repository of knowledge used by a specific circle of authority. Another, more speculative interpretation considers the possibility of symbolic or coded communication embedded within its structure. Medieval manuscripts occasionally employed layered meanings, allegorical references, or structured ambiguity, especially when addressing sensitive political or theological issues. If the Codex contained such elements, its purpose may not have been immediately visible to outside observers. However, no definitive decoded message has ever been identified. No single section has been conclusively proven to conceal hidden content beyond standard medieval practice. And this is where the mystery settles into uncertainty. Because what makes the Zouche Codex intriguing is not the presence of confirmed anomalies, but the persistent difficulty of categorizing it neatly. It exists at the intersection of law, religion, administration, and manuscript culture, areas that were deeply interconnected in medieval England, yet not always clearly separated in surviving records. The Zouche family itself adds another layer of context. As landholders and officials, they operated within a system where written documentation was essential for maintaining rights, resolving disputes, and asserting authority. Manuscripts in their possession would naturally reflect the complexity of these responsibilities. Yet even within this practical framework, the blending of content types in the Codex continues to raise questions about intent. Was it simply a working document that evolved over time through normal administrative use? Or was it deliberately structured in a way that served multiple audiences, some official, some internal, and some perhaps never intended to be fully understood outside a narrow context? Modern manuscript studies provide tools to analyze ink composition, handwriting styles, and textual layering. These methods can reveal how a document developed over time, whether it was written by multiple scribes, and how later additions were incorporated. Yet even with these techniques, interpretation remains dependent on context that is often incomplete. The Zouche Codex survives not as a fully intact, continuously interpreted artifact, but as a partially understood object embedded in broader historical silence. And so scholars are left with fragments of description, references in catalogs, and limited surviving material that resist definitive categorization. This uncertainty opens space for broader reflection. Because medieval manuscripts often blur the line between practical function and conceptual meaning. A single document could serve legal, administrative, theological, and symbolic roles simultaneously. What appears fragmented or inconsistent to modern eyes may have been entirely coherent within its original cultural framework. Still, the question persists. If the Zouche Codex was more than a legal manuscript, what else might it have been? A private record of governance? A coded reflection of political relationships? A structured archive of knowledge meant to be read in layers rather than linearly? Or simply a complex but ordinary document whose meaning has been partially obscured by time, loss, and the limits of surviving evidence? The manuscript itself does not answer. It remains preserved in fragments of scholarship and reference, its full structure no longer entirely visible, its original intent never fully recovered. And so, like so many objects left behind by the medieval world, it invites a final, quiet question. When a manuscript appears to contain more than its surface suggests, are we looking at hidden meaning, or simply the natural complexity of a world that did not always separate function from mystery.